once in several years. A newspaper is checked by sales that vary significantly from day to day. A newspaper with no circulation is a newspaper that does not matter. A few weeks will suffice to show if it has carried its public with it or gone out of influence. It is absurd to speak of a newspaper as being less responsible than the politician. Nevertheless, the influence of a great newspaper is so much greater than that of any politician, and its power more particularly for mischief, for the creation of panic conditions, for example, so much swifter, that it is open to question whether the press is at present sufficiently held to its enormous responsibilities. Let us consider its weaknesses at the present time. Let us ask what changes in its circumstances are desirable in the public interest and what are likely to come about. We have already reckoned upon the press as a chief factor in the adequate criticism, cleansing, and modernization of the British lawyer politician. Is there any power to which we may look for the security of the press? And I submit the answer is the press. For while the legal profession is naturally homogeneous, the press is by nature heterogeneous. Dog does not eat dog, nor lawyer, lawyer. But the newspapers are sharks and cannibals. They are in a perpetual conflict. The press is a profession as open as the law is closed. It has no antisocial guild feeling. It washes its dirty linen in public by choice and necessity, and disdains all professional etiquette. Few people know what criticisms of the Lord Chief Justice may have ripened in the minds of Lord Halsbury or Sir Edward Carson, but we all know, to a very considerable degree of accuracy, the worst of what this great journalist or group of newspaper proprietors think of that. We have, therefore, considerable reason for regarding the press as being, in contrast with the legal profession, a self-reforming body. In the last decade, there has been an enormous mass of criticism of the press by the press. There has been a tendency to exaggerate its irresponsibility. A better case is to be made against it for what I will call, using the word in its least offensive sense, its venality. By venality I mean the fact, a legacy from the now happily vanishing age of individualism, that in theory and law at least anyone may own a newspaper and sell it publicly or secretly to anyone, that its circulation and advertisement receipts may be kept secret or not as the proprietors choose, and that the proprietor is accountable to no one for any exceptional incomings or any sudden fluctuations in policy. A few years ago we were all discussing who should buy the Times. I do not know what chances an agent of the Kaiser might not have had if he had been sufficiently discreet. This venality will be far more dangerous to the Allied countries after the war than during its continuance. So long as the state of war lasts, there are prompt methods available for any direct newspaper treason, and it is in the neutral countries only that the buying and selling of papers against the national interest has occurred to any marked extent. Directly peace is signed, unless we provide for the event beforehand, our press will pass under neutral conditions. There will be nothing to prevent, for example, any foreseeing foreign power coming into Great Britain offering to buy up not only this paper or that, but also, what is far more important, to buy up the great book and newspaper distributing firms. These vitally important public services, so far as law and theory go, will be as entirely in the market as railway tickets at a station, unless we make some intelligent preventative provision. Unless we do, and if, as is highly probable, peace puts no immediate stop to international malignity, the Germans will be bigger fools than I think them if they do not try to get hold of these public services. It is a matter of primary importance in the outlook of every country in Europe, therefore, that it should insist upon and secure responsible native ownership of every newspaper and news and book distributing agency, and the most drastic punishment for newspaper corruption. Given that guarantee against foreign bribery, we may, I think, let free speech rage. This is so much a matter of common sense that I cannot imagine even British wait and see waiting for the inevitable assault upon our national journalistic virtue that will follow the peace. So I spread out the considerations that I think justify our forecasting in a very changed Great Britain and a changed Europe. Firstly, a legal profession with a quickened conscience, a sense of public function, and a reformed organization. And secondly, a press which is recognized and held accountable in law and in men's minds, as an estate of the realm, as something implicitly under oath to serve the state. I do not agree with Professor Michel's pessimistic conclusion that peace will bring back exasperated party politics and a new era of futility to the democratic countries. I believe that the tremendous demonstration of this war, a demonstration that gains weight with every week of our lengthening effort, of the waste and inefficiency of the system of 1913 to 14, will break down at last even the conservatism of the most rigidly organized and powerful and out of date of all professions. It is not only that I look to the indignation and energy of intelligent men who are outside our legal and political system to reform it, but to those who are in it now. A man may be quietly parasitic upon his mother, and yet incapable of matricide. So much of our national energy and ability has been attracted to the law in Great Britain that our nation, with our lawyers in modern clothing, instead of wigs and gowns, lawyers who have studied science and social theory instead of the spoutings of Cicero and the loquacious artfulness of W.E. Gladstone, lawyers who look forward at the destiny of their country instead of backward at the markings of their briefs, may yet astonish the world. The British lawyer really holds the future of the British Empire, and indeed, I could almost say, of the whole world in his hands at the present time, as much as any single sort of man can be said to hold it. Inside his skull, imagination, and the heavy devil of evil, President, fight for his soul and welfare of the world. A generosity fights against tradition and individualism. Only the men of the press have anything like the same great possibilities of betrayal. These two sorts of men, the dim spirit of the nation looks for such leading as a democracy can follow. To them, the men with every sort of special ability, the men of science, the men of this or that sort of administrative ability and experience, the men of creative gifts and habits, every sort of man who wants the world to get on, look for the removal or the ingenious contrivance of obstructions and entanglements, for the allaying or the fomentation of suspicion, misapprehension, and ignorant opposition, for administration or class blackmail. Yet, while I sit as a prophetic amateur weighing these impalpable forces of will and imagination and habit and interest in lawyer, pressman, maker, and administrator, and feeling by no means overconfident of the issue, it dawns upon me suddenly that there is another figure present, who has never been present before in the reckoning up of British affairs. It is a silent figure. The figure stands among the pressmen and among the lawyers and among the workers. For a couple of decades at least, he will be everywhere in the British system. He is young and he is uniformed in khaki, and he brings with him a new spirit into British life, the spirit of the new soldier, the spirit of subordination to a common purpose. France, which has lived so much farther and deeper and more bitterly than Britain knows. Footnote: in An Englishman Looks at the World, a companion volume to the present one, which was first published by Mr. Caswell early in 1914 and is now obtainable in a shilling edition, the reader will find a full discussion of the probable benefit of proportional representation in eliminating the party hack from political life. Proportional representation would probably break up party organizations altogether, and it would considerably enhance the importance and responsibility of the press. It would do much to accelerate the development of the state of affairs here foreshadowed, in which the role of government and opposition under the party system will be played by elective representatives and press, respectively. Chapter 7. The New Education. Some few months ago, Mr. Harold Spender in the Daily News was calling attention to a very significant fact indeed. The higher education in England, and more particularly the educational process of Oxford and Cambridge, which has been going on continuously since the Middle Ages, is practically in a state of suspense. Oxford and Cambridge have stopped. They have stopped so completely that Mr. Spender can speculate whether they can ever pick up again and resume upon the old lines. For my part, as the father of two sons who are at present in mid-school, I hope with all my heart that they will not. I hope that the Oxford and Cambridge of unphilosophical classics and little go Greek for everybody, dons mathematics, bad French, ignorance of all Europe except Switzerland, forensic exercises in the Union Debating Society, and cant about the Gothic, the Oxford and Cambridge that turned boys full of life and hope and infinite possibility into barristers, politicians, monolingual diplomatists, bishops, schoolmasters, company directors, and remittance men are even now dead. Quite recently I passed through Cambridge, and with the suggestions of Mr. Spender in my mind, I paused to savour the atmosphere of the place. He had very greatly understated the facts of the case. He laid stress upon the fact that instead of the normal 4,000 undergraduates or so, there are now scarcely 400. But before I was fairly in Cambridge, I realised that that gives no idea of the real cessation of English education. Of the first 7 undergraduates I saw upon the Trumpington Road, 1 was black, 3 were coloured, and 1 of the remaining 3 was certainly not British, but I should guess Spanish American. And it isn't only the undergraduates who have gone. All the dons of military age and quality have gone too, or are staying up, not in caps and gowns, but in khaki. All the vigorous teachers are soldiering. There are no dons left except those who are unfit for service, and the clergy. Buildings, libraries, empty laboratories, empty lecture theatres, vestiges, refugees, neutrals, khaki. That is Cambridge today. There never was before. There never may be again. So wonderful an opportunity for a cleaning up and sweeping out of those two places, and for a profitable new start in British education. The cessation of Oxford and Cambridge does not give the full measure of the present occasion. All the other British universities are in a like case, and the schools which feed them have been practically swept clean of their senior boys. And not a tithe of any of this war class of schoolboys will ever go to the universities now. Not a tithe of the war class of undergraduates will ever return. Between the new education and the old, there will be a break of 2 school generations. For the next 30 or 40 years, an exceptional class of men will play a leading part in British affairs. Men who will have learnt more from reality and less from lectures than either the generations that preceded or the generations that will follow them. The subalterns of the Great War will form a distinct generation and mark an epoch. Their experiences of need, their sense of deficiencies will certainly play a large part in the reconstitution of British education. The stamp of the old system will not be on them. Now is the time to ask, what sort of training should a university give to produce the ruling, directing, and leading men which it exists to produce? Upon that Great Britain will need to make up its mind speedily. It is not a matter for tomorrow or the day after. It is necessary to decide now what it is the Britain that is coming will need and want, and to set the work revising the admission and degree requirements and reconstructing all those systems of public examinations for the public services that necessarily dominate school and university teaching before the universities and schools reassemble. If the rotten old things once get together again, the rotten old things will have a new lease of life. This and no other is the hour for educational reconstruction, and it is in the decisions and readjustments of schools and lectures and courses, far more than anywhere else, that the real future of Great Britain will be decided. Equally true is this of all the belligerent countries. Much of the future has a kind of mechanical inevitableness, but here, far more than anywhere else, can a few resolute and capable men mold the spirit and determine the quality of the Europe to come. Now, surely the chief things that are needed in the education of a ruling class are these. First, the selection and development of character, then the selection and development of capacity, and thirdly, the imparting of knowledge upon broad and comprehensive lines, and the power of rapidly taking up and using such detailed knowledge as may be needed for special occasions. It is upon the first count that the British schools and universities have been most open to criticism. We have found the British university-trained class under the fiery tests of this war an evasive, temporizing class of people, individualistic, ungenerous, and unable either to produce or obey vigorous leadership. On the whole, it is a matter of congratulation. It says wonderful things for the inherent natural qualities of the English-speaking peoples, that things have proved no worse than they are, considering the nature of the higher education under which they have suffered. Consider in what that educational process has consisted. Its backbone has been the teaching of Latin by men who can read, write, and speak it rather worse than a third-rate babu speaks English, and of ancient Greek by teachers who at best half know this fine lost language. They do not expect any real mastery of either tongue by their students, and naturally, therefore, no real mastery is ever attained. The boys and young men just muff about at it for 3 times as long as would be needed to master completely both those tongues if they had live teachers, and so they acquire habits of busy futility and petty pedantry in all intellectual processes that haunt them throughout life. There are also sterile mathematical studies that never get from exercises to practice. There is a pretense of studying philosophy based on Greek texts that few of the teachers and none of the taught can read comfortably, and a certain amount of history. The modern history school at Oxford, for example, is the queerest collection of chunks of reading. English history from the beginning, with occasional glances at continental affairs. European history for about a century, bits of economics and the politics of Aristotle. It is not education, it is a jackdaw collection. The sort of jumble has been the essentials of the more pretentious type of higher education available in Great Britain up to the present. In this manner, through all the most sensitive and receptive years of life, our boys have been trained in how not to get there in a variety of disconnected subjects by men who have never got there, and it would be difficult to imagine any curriculum more calculated to produce a miscellaneous incompetence. They have also, it happens, received a certain training in savoir-faire through the collective necessities of school life, and a certain sharpening in the arts of advocacy through the debate in society. Except for these latter helps, they have had to face the world with minds neither more braced, nor more trained, nor more informed than any uneducated man's. Surely the first condition that should be laid down for the new education in Europe is that whatever is undertaken must be undertaken in grim earnest and done. It is ridiculous to talk about the character-forming value of any study that does not go through to an end. Manifestly, Greek must be dropped as a part of the general curriculum for a highly educated man, for the simple reason that now there are scarcely any competent teachers, and because of the sham of teaching, it partially and pretentiously demoralizes student and school alike. The claim of the clergy and so forth to know Greek is one of the many corrupting lies in British intellectual life. English comic writers never weary of sneering at the Hindu who claim to be a failed BA, but what is the ordinary classical degree man of an English university but a failed Greek scholar? Latin too must be either reduced to the position of a study supplementary to the native tongue or brought up to an honest level of efficiency. French and German, in the case of the English, and English in the case of the French and Russians, are essentially governess languages. Any intelligent boy or girl from a reasonably prosperous home ought to be able to read, write, and speak either before 15. They are to be taken by the way rather than regarded as a fundamental part of education. The French, German, or English literature and literary development up to and including contemporary work is, of course, an entirely different matter. But there can be no doubt of the great educational value of some highly inflected and well-developed language taught by men to whom it is a genuine means of expression. Educational needs and public necessity point alike to such languages as Russian, or in the case of Great Britain, Hindustani, to supply this sound training. If Great Britain means business after this war, if she is to do her duty by the Eastern world she controls, she will not stick at the pretty expense of getting a few hundred of good Russian and Hindu teachers into the country, and she will place Russian and Hindustani upon at least an equal footing with Greek in all her university and competitive examinations. Moreover, it is necessary to set a definite aim of application before university mathematical teaching. As the first condition of character building in all these things, the student should do what he ostensibly sets out to do. No degree and no position should be attainable by half accomplishment. Of course, languages and mathematics do not by any means round off the education of a man of the leading classes. There is no doubt much exercise in their attainment, much value in their possession, but the essence of the higher education is now, as it always has been, philosophy, not the antiquated pretense of reading Plato and Aristotle, but the thorough and subtle examination of those great questions of life that most exercise and strengthen the mind. Surely that is the essential difference of the educated and the common man. The former has thought and thought out thoroughly and clearly the relations of his mind to the universe as a whole, and of himself to the state and life. A mind untrained in swift and adequate criticism is essentially an uneducated mind, though it has as many languages as a courier and as much computation as a bookie. And what is our fundamental purpose in all this reform of our higher education? It is neither knowledge nor technical skill, but to make our young men talk less and think more, and to think more swiftly, surely, and exactly. For that we want less debating society and more philosophy, fewer prizes for forensic ability, and more for strength and vigour of analysis. The central seat of character is the mind. A man of weak character thinks vaguely. A man of clear intellectual decisions acts with precision and is free from vacillation. A country of educated men acts coherently, smites swiftly, plans ahead. A country of confused education is a country of essential muddle. It is as the third factor in education that the handling and experience of knowledge comes. And of all knowledge, that which is most accessible, most capable of being handled with the greatest variety of educational benefit, so as to include the criticism of evidence, the massing of facts, the extraction and testing of generalizations, lies in two groups of the biological sciences and the exact sciences. No doubt a well-planned system of education will permit from much varied specialization, will indeed specialize those who have special gifts from a very early age, will have corners for Greek, Hebrew, Sanskrit, philology, archaeology, Christian theology, and so on and so on. Nevertheless, for that great mass of sound men of indeterminate all-round ability, who are the intellectual and moral backbone of a nation, it is in scientific studies that their best training lies, studies most convenient to undertake and most readily applied in life. From either of the two groups of the sciences, one may press on to research or to technical applications leading directly to the public service. The biological sciences broaden out through psychology and sociology to the theory and practice of law and to political life. They lead also to medical and agricultural administration. The exact sciences lead to the administrative work of industrialism and to general economics. These are the broad, clear lines of the educational necessities of a modern community, plain enough to see, so that every man who is not blinded by prejudice and self-interest can see them today. We have now before us a phase of opportunity in educational organization that will never recur again. Now that the apostolic succession of the old pedagogy is broken and the entire system discredited, it seems incredible that it can ever again be reconstituted in its old seats upon the old lines. In these raw, harsh days of boundless opportunity, the opportunity of the new education, because it is the most fundamental, is assuredly the greatest of all. Chapter 8: What the War is Doing for Women. Section 1. To discuss the effect of this war upon the relations of men and women to each other is to enter upon the analysis of a secular process compared with which even the vast convulsions and destructions of this world catastrophe appear only as jolts and incidents and temporary interruptions. There are certain matters that sustain a perennial development that are on a scale beyond the dramatic happenings of history. Wars, the movements of people and races, economic changes such as things that may accelerate or stimulate or confuse or delay, but they cannot arrest the endless thinking out, the growth and perfecting of ideas upon the fundamental relationships of human beings. First among such eternally progressive issues is religion, the relationship of man to God. Next in importance and still more immediate is the matter of men's relations to women. In such matters, each phase is a new phase. Whatever happens, there is no going back and beginning over again. The social life, like the religious life, must grow and change until the human story is at an end. So this war involves, in this as in so many matters, no fundamental setback, no reversals, no restorations. At the most, it will but realize things already imagined, release things latent. The 19th century was a period of unprecedented modification of social relationships, but great as these changes were, they were trivial in comparison with the changes in religious thought and the criticism of moral ideals. Hell was the basis of religious thinking in AD 1800, and the hangman was at the back of the law. In 1900, both hell and the hangman seemed on the verge of extinction. The creative impulse was everywhere, replacing fear and compulsion in human motives. The opening decade of the 20th century was a period of unprecedented abundance in everything necessary to human life, of vast accumulated resources, of leisure and release. It was also, because of that and because of the changed social and religious spirit, a period of great social disorganization and confused impulses. We British can already look back to the opening half of 1914 as to an age gone forever. Except that we were all alive then and can remember, it has become now almost as remote, almost as historical as the days before the French Revolution. Our days, our methods and reactions are already so different. The greater part of the freedom of movement, the travel and going to and fro, the leisure, the plenty and carelessness that distinguished early 20th century life from early 19th century life has disappeared. Most men are under military discipline and every household economizes. The whole British people has been brought up against such elementary realities of need, danger, and restraint as it never realized before. We discover that we had been living like Olympians in regard to worldly affairs. We had been irresponsibles, amateurs. Much of that fatness of life, the wrappings and trimmings of our life, has been stripped off altogether. That has not altered the bones of life, it has only made them plainer, but it has astonished us as much as if looking into a looking glass, one suddenly found oneself a skeleton or a diagram. What was going on before this war in the relations of men and women is going on still, with more rapidity perhaps, and certainly with more thoroughness. The war is accentuating, developing, defining. Previously, our discussions and poses and movements had merely the air of seeking to accentuate and define. What was apparently being brought about by discursive efforts and in a mighty controversy and confusion is coming about now as a matter of course. Before the war, in the British community, as in most civilized communities, profound changes were already in progress. Changes in the conditions of women's employment, in the legal relations of husband and wife, in the political status of women, in the status of illegitimate children, in manners and customs affecting the sexes. Every civilized community was exhibiting a falling birth rate and a falling death rate, was changing the quality of its housing and diminishing domestic labor by organizing supplies and developing appliances. That is to say that primary human unit, the home, was altering in shape and size and frequency and color and effect. A steadily increasing proportion of people were living outside the old family home, the home based on maternity and offspring altogether. A number of us were doing our best to apprehend the summation of all this flood of change. We had a vague idea that women were somehow emancipated, but just what this word meant and what it implied were matters still under exploration. Then came the war. For a time, it seemed as if all this discussion was at an end, as if the problem itself had vanished. But that was only a temporary distraction of attention. The process of change swelled into new forms that did not fit very easily into the accepted formulae, swelled into new forms and continued on its way. If the discussion ceased for a time, the process of change ceased not at all. Matters have travelled all the farther in the last 2 years of travelling mutually. The questions between men and women are far more important and far more incessant than the questions between Germans and the rest of mankind. They are coming back now into the foreground of human thought, but amended and altered. Our object is to state the general nature of that alteration. It has still been emancipation, but very different in quality from the emancipation that was demanded so loudly and incoherently in that ancient world of 1913. Never had the relations of men and women been so uneasy as they were in the opening days of 1914. The women's movement battered and banged through all our minds. It broke out into that tumult in Great Britain perhaps 10 years ago. When Queen Victoria died, it was inaudible. Search the newspapers of that tranquil age. In 1914, it kicked up so great a dust that the Germans counted on the suffragettes as one of the great forces that were to paralyze England in the war. The extraordinary thing was that the feminist movement was never clearly defined during all the time of its maximum violence. We begin to perceive in the retrospect that the movement was multiple, made up of a number of very different movements interwoven. It seemed to concentrate upon the vote, but it was never possible to find even why women wanted the vote. Some, for example, alleged that it was because they were like men, and some because they were entirely different. The broad facts that one could not mistake were a vast feminine discontent and a vast display of feminine energy. What had brought that about? Two statistical factors are to be considered here. One of these was the steady decline in the marriage rate and the increasing proportion of unmarried women of all classes, but particularly of the more educated classes, requiring employment. The second was the fall in the birth rate, the diminution in size of the average family, the increase of sterile unions, and the consequent release of a considerable proportion of energy of married women. Cooperating with these factors of release were the economic elaborations that were improving the appliances of domestic life, replacing the needle by the sewing machine, the coal fire and lamp by gas and electricity, the dustpan and brush by the pneumatic carpet cleaner, and taking out of the house into the shop and factory the baking, much of the cooking, the making of clothes, the laundry work, and so forth, that had hitherto kept so many women at home and too busy to think. The care of even such children as there were was also less arduous. Creche and school held out hands for them. ready to do even that duty better. Side by side with these releases from duty was a rise in the standard of education that was stimulating the minds and imaginations of women beyond the point where the needle, even if there had been any use for the needle, can be an opiate. Moreover, the world was growing richer, and growing richer in such a way that not only were leisure and desire increasing, but because of increasingly scientific methods of production, the need in many branches of employment for any but very keen and able workers was diminishing. So that simultaneously the world, that vanished world before 1914, was releasing and disengaging enormous volumes of untrained and unassigned feminine energy, and also diminishing the usefulness of unskilled effort in every department of life. There was no demand to meet the supply. These were the underlying processes that produced the feminist outbreak of the decade before the war. Now, the debate between the sexes is a perennial. It began while we were still in the trees. It has its stereotyped accusations, its stereotyped repartees. The Canterbury Pilgrims had little to learn from Christabel Pankhurst. Man and woman in that duet struggle perpetually for the upper hand, and the man restrains the woman, and the woman resents the man. In every age, some voice has been heard asserting, like Plato, that the woman is a human being, and the prompt answer has been, but such a different human being. Wherever there is a human difference, fair play is difficult. The universal clash of races witnesses to that, and sex is the greatest of human differences. But the general trend of mankind towards intelligence and reason has been also a trend away from a superstitious treatment of sexual questions and the recognition, so to speak, that a woman is indeed as entitled to an independent soul and a separate voice in collective affairs. As brain has counted for more and more in the human effort and brute strength, and the advantage of not bearing children for less and less, as man has felt a greater need for a companion and a lesser need for a slave, and as the increase of food and protection of the girl from premature childbearing has approximated the stature and strength and enterprise of the woman more and more to that of the man, this secular emancipation of the human female from the old herd subordination and servitude to the patriarchal male has gone on. Essentially, the secular process has been an equalizing process. It was merely the exaggeration of its sustaining causes during the plentine social and intellectual expansion of the last half-century that had stimulated this secular process to the pitch of crisis. There have always been two extreme aspects of the sexual debate. There have always been the oversexed women who wanted to be treated primarily as women, and the women who were irritated and bored by being treated primarily as women. There have always been those women who wanted to get, like Joan of Arc, into masculine attire and the school of the mystical darlings. There have always been the women who wanted to share men's work, and the women who wanted to inspire it, the mates and the mistresses. Of course, the mass of women lies between these extremes. But it is possible, nevertheless, to discuss this question as though it were a conflict of two sharply opposed ideals. It is convenient to write as if there were just these two sorts of women, so that one can get a sharp definition of the picture. The ordinary woman fluctuates between the two, turns now to the Western ideal of citizenship and now to the Eastern of submission. These ideals fight not only in human society, but in every woman's career. Chitra in Rabindranath Tagore's play, for example, tried both aspects of the woman's life, and Tagore is at one with Plato in preferring the Rosalind type to the Houri. And with him I venture to think it is the clear reason of mankind. The real emancipation to which reason and the trend of things makes is from the yielding to the energetic side of a woman's disposition, from beauty enthroned for love towards the tall, weather-hardened woman with a spear, loving her mate as her mate loves her, and as sexless as a man in all her busy hours. But it was not simply the energies that tended towards this particular type that were set free during the latter half of the 19th century. Every sort of feminine energy was set free, and it was not merely the self-reliant, independent-seeking women who were discontented. The ladies who specialized in feminine arts and graces and mysteries were also dissatisfied. They found they were not important enough. The former type found itself insufficiently respected, and the latter type found itself insufficiently adored. The two mingled their voices in the most confusing way in the literature of the suffragette movement before the war. The two tendencies mingle confusingly in the minds of the women that this movement was stirring up to think. The vote became the symbol for absolutely contradictory things. There is scarcely a single argument for it in suffragist literature that cannot be completely negatived out in suffragist literature. For example, compare the writings of Miss Cicely Hamilton, the distinguished actress, with the publications of the Pankhurst family. The former expresses a claim that, except for prejudice, a woman is as capable a citizen as a man and differing only in her sex. The latter consists of a long rhapsody upon the mystical superiorities of women and the marvelous benefits mankind will derive from handing things over to these sacred powers. The former would get rid of sex from most human affairs. The latter would make what our Georgian grandfathers called the sex rule the world. Or compare, say, the dark coquettings of Miss Elizabeth Robins' Woman's Secret with the virile common sense of that most brilliant young writer, Miss Rebecca West, in her bitter onslaught on feminine limitations in the opening chapters of The World's Worst Failure. The former is an extravagance of sexual mysticism. Man can never understand women. Women always hide deep and wonderful things away beyond masculine discovery. Men do not even suspect. Someday, perhaps it is someone peeping from behind a curtain and inviting men in provocative tones to come and play catch in a darkened harem. The latter is like some gallant soldier cursing his silly accoutrements. It is a hearty outbreak against that apparent necessity for elegance and sexual specialization that undercuts so much feminine achievement, that reduces so much feminine art and writing to vapidity, and holds back women from the face of danger and brave and horrible deaths. It is west to Miss Robins' east. And yet I believe I am right in saying that all these four women writers have jostled one another upon suffrage platforms, and that they are all suffering blows and injuries in the same cause, during the various riots and conflicts that occurred in London in the course of the Great Agitation. It was only when the agitation of the Pankhurst family, aided by Miss Robins' remarkable book, Where Are You Going To?, took a form that threatened to impose the most extraordinary restrictions on the free movements of women and to establish a sort of universal purdah of hostility and suspicion against those degraded creatures, those stealers and destroyers of women, the men, that the British feminist movement displayed any tendency to disassociate into its opposed and divergent strands. It is a little detail, but a very significant one in this connection, that the committee that organized the various great suffrage processions in London were torn by dispute about the dresses of the processionists. It was urged that a masculine style of costume discredited the movement, and women were urged to dress with a maximum of feminine charm. Many women obtained finery they could ill afford to take part in these demonstrations, and minced their steps as womanly as possible to freedom. It would be easy to overstate the efflorescence of distinctively feminine emotion, dressiness, mysticism, and vanity upon the suffrage movement. Those things showed for anyone to see. This was the froth of the whirlpool. What did not show was the tremendous development of the sense of solidarity among women. Everybody knew that women had been hitting policemen at Westminster. It was not nearly so showy a fact that women of title, working women, domestic servants, tradesmen's wives, professional workers, had all been meeting together and working together in a common cause, working with an unprecedented capacity and an unprecedented disregard of social barriers. One noted the nonsensical byplay of the movement, the way in which women were accustoming themselves to higher standards of achievement was not so immediately noticeable. That a small number of women were apparently bent on rendering the vote impossible by a campaign of violence and malicious mischief very completely marks the fact that a very great number of girls and young women no longer considered it seemly to hang about at home trying by a few crude inducements to tempt men to marry them, but were setting out very seriously and capably to master the young man's way of finding a place for oneself in the world. Beneath the dust and noise, realities were coming about that the dust and noise entirely failed to represent. We know that some women were shrieking for the vote. We did not realize that a generation of women was qualifying for it. The war came, the jolt of an earthquake, to throw things into their proper relationships. The immediate result was the disappearance of the militant suffragists from public view for a time, into which the noisier section hastened to emerge in full scream upon the congenial topics of war babies. Men, those dreadful creatures, were being camped and quartered all over the country. It followed from all the social principles known to Mrs. and Miss Pankhurst that it was necessary to provide for an enormous number of war babies. Subscriptions were invited. Statisticians are still looking rather perplexedly for those war babies. The illegitimate birth rate has fallen, and what has become of the subscriptions I do not know. The suffragette rechristened itself Britannia, dropped the war baby agitation, and, after an interlude of self-control, broke out into denunciations, first of this public servant and then of that, as traitors and German spies. Finally, it discovered a mare's nest in the case of Sir Edward Grey that led to its suppression, and the last I have from this misleading and unrepresentative feminist faction is the periodic appearance of a little ill-printed sheet of abuse about the chief Foreign Office people, resembling in manner and appearance the sort of denunciatory letter, at once suggestive and evasive, that might be written by the curate's discharged cook. And with that, the aggressive section of the suffragist movement seems to have petered out, leaving the broad reality of feminine emancipation to go on in a beneficent silence. There can be no question that the behaviour of the great mass of women in Great Britain has not simply exceeded expectation but hope. And there can be as little doubt that the suffrage question, in spite of the self-advertising violence of its extravagant section, did contribute very materially to build up the confidence, the willingness to undertake responsibility and face hardship that has been so abundantly displayed by every class of woman. It is not simply that there has been enough women to spare for hospital work and every sort of relief and charitable service. That sort of thing has been done before. That was in the tradition of womanhood. It is that at every sort of occupation, clerking, shopkeeping, railway work, automobile driving, agricultural work, police work, they have been found efficient beyond precedent and intelligent beyond precedent. And in the munition factories, in the handling of heavy and often difficult machinery, and in adaptability and inventiveness and enthusiasm and steadfastness, their achievement has been astonishing. More particularly in relation to intricate mechanical work, is their record remarkable and unexpected. There is scarcely a point where women have been given a chance, have not more than made good. They have revolutionized the estimate of their economic importance, and it is scarcely too much to say that when, in the long run, the military strength of the Allies bears down the strength of Germany, it will be this superiority of our women which enables us to pit a woman at The censorship will object to exact geography upon this point, against the man at Essen, which has tipped the balance of this war. Those women have won the vote. Not the most frantic outbursts of militancy after this war can prevent them getting it. The girls who have faced death and wound so gallantly in our cordite factories, there is a not inconsiderable list of dead and wounded from those places, have killed forever the poor argument that women should not vote because they had no military value. Indeed, they have killed every argument against their subjection. And while they do these things, that paragon of the virtues of the old type, the miracle of domestic obedience, the German Hausfrau, the faithful Gretchen, riots for butter. And, as I have before remarked, the Germans counted on the suffragettes as one of the great forces that were to paralyze England in this war. It is not simply that the British women have so bountifully produced intelligence and industry that does not begin their record. They have been willing to go dowdy. The mass of women in Great Britain are wearing the clothes of 1914. In 1913, every girl and woman saw one in the streets of London had an air of doing her best to keep in the fashion. Now, they are for the most part as carelessly dressed as a busy businessman or a clever young student might have been. They are none the less pretty for that, and far more beautiful. But the fashion have floated away to absurdity. Every now and then, through the austere bustle of London in wartime, drifts a last practitioner of the eternal feminine, with the air of a foreign visitor, with the air of devotion to some peculiar cult. She has very high-heeled boots. She shows a leg. She has a short skirt with a peculiar hang, due no doubt to mysteries about the waist. She wears a comic little hat over one brow. There is something of Columbine about her, something of the Watteau shepherdess, something of a vivandière, something of every age about the present age. Her face, subject to the strange dictates of the mode, is smooth like the back of a spoon, with small features and little whisker-like curls before the ears, such as butcher boys used to wear half a century ago. Even so, she dare not do this thing alone. Something in khaki is with her, to justify her. You are to understand that this strange rig is for seeing him off or giving him a good time during his leave. Sometimes she is quite elderly. Sometimes nothing khaki is to be got, and the pretense that is desired of her wears thin. She does not pass with impunity, the last exponent of true feminine charm. The vulgar, the streets boy, have evolved one of those strange sayings that have the air of being fragments from some lost and forgotten chant. She's the army's contractor's only daughter, spending it now, or simply spending it now. She does not pass with impunity, but she passes. She makes her stilted passage across the arena upon which the new womanhood of Western Europe shows its worth. It is an exit. There is likely to be something like a truce in the fashions throughout Europe for some years. It is in America, if anywhere, that the holy fires of smartness and the fashion will be kept alive. And so we come to prophecy. I do not believe that this invasion by women of 100 employments hitherto closed to them is a temporary arrangement that will be reversed after the war. It is a thing that is going on, very slowly, it is true, and against such prejudice and opposition before the war, but it was going on. It is in the nature of things. These women no doubt enter these employments as substitutes, but not usually as inferior substitutes. In quite a number of cases, they are as good as men, and in many, they are not underselling. They are drawing men's pay. What reason is there to suppose that they will relapse into a state of superfluous energy after the war? The war has merely brought about, with the rapidity of a landslide, a state of affairs for which the world was ripe. The world after the war will have to adjust itself to this extension of women's employment, and to this increase in the proportion of self-respecting, self-supporting women. Contributing very largely to the establishment of this greatly enlarged class of independent women will be the great shortage of the next decade of marriageable men due to the killing and disablement of the war. The women of the next decades will not only be able to get along economically without marriage, but they will find it much more difficult to marry. It will also probably be a period in which a rise in prices may, as it usually does, precede the compensating rise in wages. It may be that for some years it will be more difficult to maintain a family. This will be a third factor in the fixation of the class of bachelor women. Various writers, brooding over the coming shortage of men, have jumped to the conclusion that polygamy is among the probabilities of the near future. They write in terms of real or affected alarm for which there is no justification. They wallow in visions of Germany legalizing polygamy and see Berlin seeking recuperation in manpower by converting herself into another Salt Lake City. But I do not think that Germany, in the face of the economic ring that the Allies will certainly draw around her, is likely to desire a very great increase in population for the next few years. I do not see any great possibility of especially rich class capable of maintaining numerous wives being sustained by the impoverished and indebted world of Europe, nor the sources from which a supply of women preferring to become constituents in a polygamous constellation rather than self-supporting free women is to be derived. The temperamental dislike of intelligent women to polygamy is at least as strong as a man's objection to polyandry. Polygamy, open or hidden, flourishes widely only where there are women to be bought. Moreover, there are considerable obstacles in religion and custom to overcome by the innovating polygamist, even in Germany. It might mean a breach of the present good relations between Germany and the Vatican. The relative inferiority of the tradition of the German to that of the other European women, its relative disposition towards feminine servitude, is no doubt a consideration on the other scale of this discussion, but I do not think it is one heavy enough to tilt back the beam. So far, from a great number of men becoming polygamists, I think it would be possible to show cause for supporting that an increasing proportion will cease even to be monogamists. The romantic excitements of the war have produced a temporary rise in the British marriage rate, but before the war it had been falling slowly and the average age at marriage had been rising, and it is quite possible that this process will be presently resumed, and as a new generation grows up to restore the balance of the sexes accelerated. We conclude, therefore, that this increase in the class of economically independent bachelor women that is now taking place is a permanent increase. It is probably being reinforced by a considerable number of war widows who will not remarry. We have to consider in what direction this mass of capable, intelligent, energetic, undomesticated free women is likely to develop, what its effect will be on social usage, and particularly how it will react upon the lives of the married women about them. Because as we have already pointed out in this chapter, the release of feminine energy upon which the feminist problem depends is twofold, being due not only to the increased unmarriedness of women through the disproportion of the sexes and the rise in the age of marriage, but also to the decreased absorption of married women in domestic duties. A woman from the point of view of this discussion is not married and done for as she used to be. She is not so extensively and completely married. Her large and increasing leisure remains the problem. The influence of this coming body of free women upon the general social atmosphere will be, I venture to think, liberalizing and relaxing in certain directions and very bracing in others. This new type of women will want to go about freely without an escort, to be free to travel alone, take rooms in hotels, sit in restaurants, and so forth. Now, as the women of the past decade showed, there are for a woman two quite antagonistic ways of going about alone. Nothing showed the duplicate nature of the suffragist movement more than the great variety of deportment of women in the London streets during that time. There were types that dressed neatly and quietly and went upon their business with intent and preoccupied faces. Their intention was to mingle as obtrusively as possible into the stream of business and be as far as possible from the ordinary purposes of traffic, men in a world of men. A man could speak to such women as he spoke to another man, without suspicion, could, for example, ask his way and be directed without being charged with annoying or accosting a delicate female. At the other extreme, there was a type of young woman who came into the streets like something precious that had got loose. It dressed itself as feminine loveliness. It carried sex like a banner and like a challenge. Its mind was fully prepared by the Pankhurst literature for insult. It swept past distressed manhood, imputing motives. It was pure harem, and the perplexed masculine intelligence could never determine whether it was out for a demonstration or whether it was out for a spree. Its motives in thus marching across the path of feminine emancipation were probably more complicated and confused than the alternative suggests, and sheer vanity abounded in the mixture. But undoubtedly, that extremity is the vanishing extremity of these things. The new free woman is going to be a grave and capable being, soberly dressed and imposing her own decency and neutrality of behavior upon the men she meets. And along the line of sober costume and simple and restrained behavior that the free woman is marking out, the married woman will also escape to new measures of freedom. I do not believe that among women of the same social origins and the same educational quality, there can exist side by side entirely distinct schools of costume, deportment, and behavior based on entirely divergent views of life. I do not think that men can be trained to differentiate between different sorts of women they will often be meeting simultaneously, and to treat this one with frankness and fellowship, and that one with awe and passion and romantic old world gallantry. All sorts of intermediate types, the majority of women will be intermediate types, will complicate the problem. This conflict of the citizen woman ideal with the loveliness woman ideal, which was breaking out very plainly in the British suffrage movement before the war, will certainly return after the war, and I have little doubt which way the issue will fall. The human being is going to carry it against the sexual being. The struggle is going to be extensive and various and prolonged. But in the serious years ahead, the serious type must, I feel, win. The plain, well-made dress will oust the ribbon of the décolletage. In every way, the war is accelerating the emancipation of women from sexual specialization. It is facilitating their economic emancipation. It is liberating types that will inevitably destroy both the atmosphere or gallantry, which is such a bar to friendliness between people of opposite sexes, and that atmosphere of hostile distrust, which is its counterpart in the minds of the over-sexual suffragettes. It is arresting the change of fashions and simplifying manners. In another way, also, it is working to the same end. That fall in the birth rate, which has been so marked a feature in the social development of all modern states, has become much more perceptible since the war began to tell upon domestic comfort. There is a full cradle agitation going on in Germany to check this decline. German mothers are being urged not to leave the Crown Prince of 1930 or 1940 without the necessary material for glory at some fresh battle of Verdun. I doubt the zeal of their response. But somewhere the war signifies economic stress, which must necessarily continue long after the war is over, and in the present state of knowledge, that stress means fewer children. The family, already light, will grow lighter. This means that marriage, although it may be by no means less emotionally sacred, will become a lighter thing. Once, to be married was a woman's whole career. Household cares, a dozen children, and she was consumed. All her romances ended in marriage. All a decent man's romances ended there too. She proliferated and he toiled. And when the married couple had brought up some of their children and buried the others, and blessed their first grandchildren, life was over. Now, to be married is an incident in a woman's career, as in a man's. There is not the same necessity of that household, not the same close tie. The married woman remains partially a free woman and assimilates herself to the free woman. There is an increasing disposition to group solitary children and to delegate their care to specially qualified people. And this is likely to increase because the high earning power of young women will incline them to entrust their children to others, and because a shortage of men and an excess of widows will supply other women willing to undertake that care. The more foolish women will take these releases as a release into levity, but the common sense of the newer types of women will come to the help of men in recognizing the intolerable nuisance of this prolongation of flirting and charming on the part of people who have had what should be a satisfying love. Nor will there be much wealth or superfluity to make levity possible and desirable. Winsome and weak womanhood will be told bluntly by men and women alike that it is a bore. The frou-frou of skirts, the delicate mysteries of the toilette will cease to thrill any but the very young men. Marriage, deprived of its bonds of material necessity, will demand a closer and closer companionship as its justification and excuse. A marriage that does not ripen into a close personal friendship between two equals will be regarded with increasing definiteness as an unsatisfactory marriage. These things are not stated here as being desirable or undesirable. This is merely an attempt to estimate the drift and tendency of the time as it has been accentuated by the war. It works out to the realization that marriage is likely to count for less and less as a state and more as a personal relationship. It is likely to be an affair of diminishing public and increasing private importance. People who marry are likely to remain, so far as practical ends go, more detached and separable. The essential link will be the love and affection and not the home. With that go certain logical consequences. The first is that the circumstances of the unmarried mother will resemble more than they have hitherto done those of many married mothers. The harsh lines once drawn between them will dissolve. This will fall in with the long manifest tendency in modern society to lighten the disadvantages in the case of legal duties, for example, and stigma laid upon illegitimate children. And the type of marriage where personal compatibility has come to be esteemed the fundamental thing will be altogether more amenable to divorce than the old union which was based upon the kitchen and the nursery and the absence of any care, education, or security for children beyond the range of the parental household. Marriage will not only be lighter but more dissoluble. To summarize all that has gone before, this war is accelerating rather than deflecting the stream of tendency and is bringing us rapidly to a state of affairs in which women will be much more definitely independent of their sexual status, much less hampered by their self-development, and much more nearly equal to men than has ever been known before in the whole history of mankind. Chapter 9. The New Map of Europe. Section 1. In this chapter it is proposed to embark upon what may seem now, with the Great War still in progress and still undecided, the most hopeless of all prophetic adventures. This is to speculate upon the redrawing of the map of Europe after the war. But because the detailed happenings and exact circumstances of the ending of the war are uncertain, they need not alter the inevitable broad conclusion. I have already discussed that conclusion and pointed out that the war has become essentially a war of mutual exhaustion. This does not mean, as some hasty readers may assume, that I foretell a draw. We may be all white and staggering, but Germany is, I believe, fated to go down first. She will make the first advances towards peace. She will ultimately admit defeat. But I do not want to insist that by that time, every belligerent and not simply German, will be exhausted to a pitch of extreme reasonableness. There will be no power left as Germany was left in 1871, in a state of freshness and a dictatorial attitude. That is to say, they will all be gravitating not to triumphs, but to such a settlement as seems to promise the maximum of equilibrium in the future. If towards that end the war of the United States should decide, after all, to abandon their present attitude of superior comment and throw their weight in favour of such a settlement as would make the recrudescence of militarism impossible, the general exhaustion may give America a relative importance far beyond any influence she could exert at the present time. In the end, America may have the power to insist upon almost vital conditions in the settlement, though whether she will have the imaginative force and will is, of course, quite another question. And before I go on to speculate about the actual settlement, there are one or two generalizations that it may be interesting to try over. Law is a thin wash that we paint over the firm outlines of reality, and the treaties and agreements of emperors and kings and statesmen have little of the permanence of certain more fundamental human realities. I was looking the other day at Sir Mark Sykes' The Caliph's Inheritance, which contains a series of coloured maps of the political boundaries of southwestern Asia for the last 3,000 years. The shapes and colours come and go. Now it is Persia, now it is Macedonia, now the Eastern Empire, now the Arab, now the Turk who is ascendant. The colours change as if they were in a kaleidoscope. They advance, recede, split, vanish. But through all that time there exists obstinately an Armenia, an essential Persia, an Arabia. They too advance or recede a little. I do not claim that they are eternal things, but they are far more permanent things than any rulers or empires. They are rooted to the ground by a peasantry, by a physical and temperamental attitude. Apart from political maps of mankind, there are natural maps of mankind. I find it too in Europe. The monarchs splash the water and break up the mirror in endless strange shapes. Nevertheless, always it is tending back to its enduring forms. Always it is gravitating back to a Spain, to a Gaul, to an Italy, to a Serbo-Croatia, to a Bulgaria, to a Germany, to a Poland. Poland and Armenia and Egypt destroyed, subjugated, invincible, I would take as typical of what I mean by the natural map of mankind. Let me repeat again that I do not assert there is an eternal map. It does change. There have been times, the European settlement of America and Serbia, for example, the Arabics sweep across North Africa, the invasion of Britain by the Low German peoples, when it has changed very considerably in a century or so, but at its swiftest, it still takes generations to change. The gentlemen who used to sit in conferences and diets and divide up the world ever and again before the 19th century never realized this. It is only within the last 100 years that mankind has begun to grasp the fact that one of the first laws of political stability is to draw your political boundaries along the lines of the natural map of mankind. Now, the 19th century phrased this conception by talking about the principle of nationality. Such interesting survivals of the 19th century as Mr. C.R. Buxton still talk on settling human affairs by that principle. But happily for him, the world is not so simply divided. There are tribal regions with no national sense. There are extensive regions of the Earth's surface where the population is not homogeneous, where people of different languages or different incompatible creeds live village against village, a kind of human emulsion incapable of any true mixture or unity. Consider, for example, Central Africa, Tyrone, Albania, Bombay, Constantinople, or Transylvania. Here are regions and cities with either no nationality or with as much nationality as a patchwork quilt has colour. Now, so far as the homogeneous regions of the world go, I am quite prepared to sustain the thesis that they can only be tranquil, they can only develop their possibilities freely and be harmless to their neighbours when they are governed by local men, by men of the local race, religion, and tradition, and with a form of government that, unlike a monarchy or a plutocracy, does not crystallize commercial or national ambition. So far, I go with those who would appeal to the principle of nationality, but I would stipulate further that it would be enormously an increase of the stability of the arrangement if such nations could be grouped together into United States wherever there were possibilities of interstate rivalries and commercial friction. Where, however, one deals with a region of mixed nationality, there is need for a subtler system of adjustments. Such a system has already been worked out in the case of Switzerland, where we have the community not in countries but cantons, each with its own religion, its culture and self-government, and all the peace under a polyglot and impartial common government. It is as plain as daylight to anyone who is not blinded by patriotic private interests that such a country as Albania, which is monolingual indeed, but hopelessly divided religiously, will never be tranquil, never contented, unless it is under a cantonal system. And that the only solution of the Irish difficulty along the belt between Ulster and Catholic Ireland lies in the same arrangement. Then, thirdly, there are the regions and cities possessing no nationality, such as Constantinople or Bombay, which manifestly appertain not to one nation but many, the former to all the Black Sea nations, the latter to all India. Disregarding ambitions and traditions, it is fairly obvious that such international places would be best under the joint control of and form a basis of union between all the peoples affected. Now, it is suggested here that upon these threefold lines, it is possible to work out a map of the world of maximum contentment and stability, and that there will be a gravitation of all other arrangements, all empires and leagues and whatnot, towards this rational and natural map of mankind. This does not imply that the map will ultimately assert itself, but that it will always be tending to assert itself. It will obsess ostensible politics. I do not pretend to know with any degree of certainty what peculiar forms of muddle and aggression may not record themselves upon the maps of 2200. I do not certainly know whether mankind will be better off or worse off then, more or less civilized, but I do know with a very considerable degree of certainty that in AD 2200 there will still be a France, an Ireland, a Germany, a Yugoslavia region, a Constantinople, a Rajputana, and a Bengal. I do not mean that these are absolutely fixed things. They may have receded or expanded, but these are the more permanent things. These are the field, the groundwork, the basic reality. These are fundamental forces over which plays the ambitions, treacheries, delusions, traditions, tyrannies, and international politics. All boundaries will tend to reveal these fundamental forms as all clothing tends to reveal the body. You may hide the waist, you will only reveal the shoulders more. You may mask, you may muffle the body, it is still alive inside, and the ultimate determining thing. And, having premised this much, it is possible to take up the problem of peace of 1917 or 1918, or wherever it is to be, with some sense of its limitations and superficiality. Section 2. We have already hazarded the prophecy that after a long war of general exhaustion, Germany will be the first to realize defeat. This does not mean that she will surrender unconditionally, but that she will be reduced to bargaining to see how much she must surrender and what she may hold. It is my impression that she will be deserted by Bulgaria and that Turkey will be out of the fighting before the end. But these are chancy matters. Against Germany, there will certainly be three great allies, France, Russia, and Britain, and almost certainly Japan will be with them. The four will probably have got to a very complete and detailed understanding among themselves. Italy, in, I fear, a slightly detached spirit, will sit at the board. Hungary will be present, sitting, so to speak, amidst the decayed remains of Austria, Romania, a little out of breath through hurrying at the last, may be present as the latest ally of Italy. The European neutrals will be at least present in spirit. Their desires will be acutely felt, but it is doubtful if the United States will count for all that they might in the decision. Such weight as America chooses to exercise would be that she would choose to exercise more. Will probably be on the side of the rational and natural settlement of the world. Now, the most important thing of all at this settlement will be the temper and nature of the Germany with which the Allies will be dealing. Let us not be blinded by the passions of war into confusing a people with its government and the artificial culture of a brief century. There is a Germany, great and civilized, a decent and admirable people, masked by imperialism, blinded by the vanity of the easy victories of half a century ago, wrapped in illusion. How far will she be chastened and disillusioned by the end of this war? The terms of peace depend enormously upon the answer to that question. If we take the extremest possibility and suppose a revolution in Germany or in South Germany, and the replacement of the Hohenzollerns in all or part of Germany by a republic, then I am convinced that for a republican Germany, there would be not simply forgiveness, but a warm welcome back to the Comity of Nations. The French, British, Belgians, and Italians, and every civilized force in Russia would tumble over one another in their eager greeting of this return to sanity. If we suppose a less extreme but more possible revolution taking the form of an inquiry into the sanity of the Kaiser and his eldest son and the establishment of constitutional safeguards for the future, that also would bring about an extraordinary modification of the resolution of the pledged allies. But no ending to this war, no sort of settlement will destroy the antipathy of the civilized peoples for the violent, pretentious, sentimental and cowardly imperialism that has so far dominated Germany. All Europe outside Germany now hates and dreads the Hohenzollerns. No treaty of peace can end that hate, and so long as Germany sees fit to identify herself with Hohenzollern dreams of empire and the warfare of massacre and assassination, there must be war henceforth, open or but thinly masked, against Germany. It will be but the elementary common sense of the situation for all the Allies to plan tariffs, exclusions, special laws against German shipping and shareholders and immigrants for so long a period as every German remains a potential servant of that system. Whatever Germany may think of the Hohenzollerns, the world outside Germany regards them as the embodiment of homicidal nationalism, and the settlement of Europe after the war, if it is to be a settlement with the Hohenzollerns, and not with the German people, must include the virtual disarming of those robber murderers against any renewal of their attack. It would be the most obvious folly to stop anywhere short of that. With Germany, we would welcome peace tomorrow. We would welcome her shipping on the seas and her flag about the world against the Hohenzollerns. It must obviously be war to the bitter end. But the ultimate of all sane European policy, as distinguished from oligarchic and dynastic foolery, is the establishment of the natural map of Europe. There exists no school of thought that can claim a moment's consideration among the Allies which aims at the disintegration of the essential Germany or the subjugation of any Germans to an alien rule. Nor does anyone grudge Germany wealth, trade, shipping, or anything else that goes with the politician's phrase of legitimate expansion for its own sake. If we do now set our minds to deprive Germany of these things in their fullness, it is in exactly the same spirit as that in which one might remove that legitimate and peaceful implement, a bread knife, from the hand of a homicidal maniac. Let but Germany cure herself of her Hohenzollern taint, and the world will grudge her wealth and economic preeminence as little as it grudges wealth and economic preeminence to the United States. Now, the probabilities of a German revolution open questions too complex and subtle for our present speculation. I would merely remark in passing that in Great Britain, at least those possibilities seem to me to be enormously underrated. For our present purpose, it would be most convenient to indicate a sort of maximum and minimum, depending upon the decision of Germany to be entirely Hohenzollern, or wholly or in part European. But in either case, we are going to assume that it is Germany which has been most exhausted by the war and which is seeking peace from the Allies, who have also, we will assume, excellent internal reasons for desiring it. With the Hohenzollerns, it is mere nonsense to dream of any enduring peace, but whether we are making a lasting and friendly peace with Germany or merely a sort of truce of military operations that will be no truce in the economic war against the Hohenzollern resources, the same essential idea will, I think, guide all the peace-desiring powers. They will try to draw the boundaries as near as they can to those of the natural map of mankind. Then, writing as an Englishman, my first thought of the European map is naturally of Belgium. Only absolute smashing defeat would force either Britain or France to consent to anything short of the complete restoration of Belgium. Rather than give the consent, they will both carry the war to, at present, undreamt of extremities. Belgium must be restored. Her neutrality must be replaced by a defensive alliance with her two Western allies, and if the world has still to reckon with Hohenzollerns, then her frontier must be thrust forward into the adjacent French-speaking country so as to minimize the chances of any second surprise. It is manifest that every frontier that gives upon the Hohenzollerns must henceforth be entrenched line behind line and held permanently by a garrison ready for any treachery, and it becomes of primary importance that the Franco-Belgian line should be as short and strong as possible. Aix, which Germany has made a mere jumping-off place for aggressions, should clearly be held by Belgium against a Hohenzollern empire, and the fortified and fiscal frontier would run from it southward to include the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg with its French sympathies and traditions in the permanent alliance. It is quite impossible to leave this ambiguous territory as it was before the war, with its railway in German hands and its postal and telegraphic service since 1913, under Hohenzollern control. It is quite impossible to hand this strongly anti-Prussian population to Hohenzollern masters. But an Englishman must needs write with diffidence upon this question of the western boundary. It is clear that all the boundaries of 1914 from Aix to Bâle are a part of ancient history. Know as you were is possible there, and it is not the business of anyone in Great Britain to redraw them. That task on our side lies between France and Belgium. The business of Great Britain in the matter is as plain as daylight. It is to support to her last man and her last ounce of gold those new boundaries her allies consider essential to their comfort and security. But I do not see how France, unless she is really convinced she is beaten, can content herself with anything less than a strong Franco-Belgian frontier from Aix, which will take in at least Metz and Saarburg. She knows best the psychology of the lost provinces, and the amount of annexation will spell weakness or strength. If she demands all Alsace-Lorraine back to the Hohenzollerns, British opinion is resolved to support her and to go through with this struggle until she gets it. To get at the direction of the new line is not to express a British opinion, but to speculate upon the opinion of France. After the experience of Luxembourg and Belgium, no one now dreams of a neutralized buffer state. What does not become French or Belgian of the Rhineland will remain German forever. That is perhaps conceivable, for example, of Strasbourg and the low-lying parts of Alsace. I do not know enough to do more than guess. It is conceivable, but I do not think that it is probable. I think the probability lies in the other direction. This war of exhaustion may be going on for a year or so more, but the end will be the thrusting in of the two extended German lines. The longer and bloodier the job is, the grimmer will be the determination of the pledged allies to exact a recompense. If the Germans offer peace while they still hold some part of Belgium, there will be dealings. If they wait until the French are in the Palatinate, then I doubt if the French will consent to go again. There will be no possible advantage to Germany in a war of resistance once the scale of her fortunes begins to sink. It is when we turn to the east of Germany that the map drawing becomes really animated. Here is a region of great decisions. The natural map shows a line of obstinately non-German communities stretching nearly from the Baltic to the Adriatic. There are Poland, Bohemia with her kindred Slovaks, the Magyars, and the Yugo-Serbs. In a second line come the Great and Little Russians, the Romanians and the Bulgarians. And here both Great Britain and France must defer to the wishes of their two allies, Russia and Italy. Neither of these countries had expressed inflexible intentions, and the situation has none of the inevitable quality of the Western line. Except for the Tsar's promise of autonomy to Poland, nothing has been promised. On the Western line, there are only two possibilities that I can see: the Aix-Belle boundary, or the sickness and death of France. On the Eastern line, nothing is fated. There seems to be enormous scope for bargaining over all this field, and here it is that the chances of compensations and consolations for Germany are to be found. Let us first consider the case for Poland. The way to a reunited Poland seems to me a particularly difficult one. The perplexity arises out of the crime of the original partition. Whichever side emerges with an effect of victory must needs give up territory if an autonomous Poland is to reappear. A victorious Germany would probably reconstitute the Duchy of Warsaw under a German prince. An entirely victorious Russia would probably rejoin Posen to Russian Poland and the Polish fragment of Galicia, and create a dependent Polish kingdom under the Tsar. Neither project would be received with unstinted delight by the Poles, but either would probably be acceptable to a certain section of them. Disregarding the dim feelings of the peasantry, Austrian Poland would probably be the most willing to retain a connection with its old rulers. The Habsburgs have least estranged the Poles. The Krakow district is the only section of Poland which has been at all reconciled to foreign control. It is the most autonomous and contented of the fragments. It is doubtful now how far national unanimity is any longer possible between the three Polish fragments. Like most English writers, I receive a considerable amount of printed matter from various schools of Polish patriotism, and wide divergences of spirit and intention appear. A weak, divided and politically isolated Poland of 12 or 15 million people under some puppet adventurer king set up between the Hohenzollerns and the Tsardom does not promise much happiness for the Poles or much security for the peace of the world. An entirely independent Poland will be a feverish field of international intrigue to which the fatal Polish temperament lends itself all too readily. It may be a battlefield again within 25 years. I think if I were a patriotic Pole, I should determine to be a Slav at any cost and make the best of Russia, ally myself with all her liberal tendencies and rise or fall with her. And I should do my utmost in a field where at present too little has been done to establish understandings and lay the foundations of a future alliance with a Czech-Slovak community to the south. But then I am not a Pole, but a Western European with a strong liking for the Russians. I am democratic and scientific, and the Poles I have met are Catholic and aristocratic and romantic, and all sorts of difficult things that I must make cooperation with them on the part of the Russians, Ruthenian peasants, Czechs, and indeed other Poles, slow and insecure. I doubt if either Germany or Russia wants to incorporate more Poles. Russia, more particularly, which has all Serbia over which to breed Russians, and I am inclined to think that there is a probability that the end of this war may find Poland still divided, and with boundary lines running across her not materially different from those of 1914. That is, I think, an undesirable probability, but until the Polish mind qualifies its desire for absolute independence with a determination to orient itself definitely to some larger political mass, it remains one that has to be considered. But the future of Poland is not really separate from that of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, nor is that again to be dealt with apart from that of the Balkans. From Danzig to the Morea, there runs across Europe a series of distinctive peoples, each too intensely different and national to be absorbed and assimilated by either of their greater neighbours, Russia or Germany, and each relatively too small to stand securely alone. None have shaken themselves free from monarchical traditions. Each may become an easy prey to dynastic follies and the aggressive obsessions of diplomacy. Centuries of bloody rearrangement may lie before this east-central belt of Europe. To the liberal idealist, the thought of a possible Swiss system or group of Swiss systems comes readily to mind. One thinks of a grouping of groups of republics, building up a United States of Eastern Europe, but neither Hohenzollern nor Tsar would welcome that. The arm of democratic France is not long enough to reach to help forward such a development, and Great Britain is never sure whether she is a crowned republic or a German monarchy. Hitherto in the Balkans, she has lent her influence chiefly to setting up those treacherous little German kings who have rewarded her so ill. The national monarchs of Serbia and Montenegro have alone kept faith with civilization. I doubt, however, if Great Britain will go on with that dynastic policy. She herself is upon the eve of profound changes of spirit and internal organization. But whenever one thinks of the possibilities of republican development in Europe as an outcome of this war, it is to realize the disastrous indifference of America to the essentials of the European situation. The United States of America could exert an enormous influence at the close of the war in the direction of a liberal settlement and of liberal institutions. They will, I fear, do nothing of the sort. It is here that the possibility of some internal change in Germany becomes of such supreme importance. The Hohenzollerns. Imperialism towers like the black threat of a new Caesarism over all the world. It may tower for some centuries, it may vanish tomorrow. A German revolution may destroy it. A small group of lunacy commissioners may fold it up and put it away. But should it go, it would at least take with it nearly every crown between Hamburg and Constantinople. The German kings would vanish like a wisp of smoke. Suppose a German revolution and a correlated step forward towards liberal institutions on the part of Russia. Then the whole stage of Eastern Europe would clear as fever goes out of a man. This age of international elbowing and jostling, of intrigue and diplomacy, of wars, massacres, deportations and mass, and the continual fluctuation of irrational boundaries would come to an end forthwith. So sweeping a change is the extreme possibility. The probability is of something less lucid and more prosaic, of a discussion of diplomatists, of patched arrangements. But even under these circumstances, the whole Eastern European situation is so fluid and little controlled by any plain necessity that there will be enormous scope for any individual statesman of imagination and force of will. There have recently been revelations, more or less trustworthy, of German schemes for a rearrangement of Eastern Europe. They implied a German victory. Bohemia, Poland, Galicia, and Ruthenia were to make a Habsburg-ruled state from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Yugoslav and the Magyar were to be linked, uneasy bedfellows, into a second kingdom, also Habsburg-ruled. Austria was to come into the German Empire as a third Habsburg dukedom or kingdom. Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece were to continue as independent powers, German-ruled. Recently, German proposals published in America have shown a disposition to admit the claims of Romania to the Wallachian districts of Transylvania. Evidently, the urgent need to create kingdoms or confederations larger than any single states as the natural map supplies is manifest to both sides. If Germany, Italy, and Russia can come to any sort of general agreement in these matters, their arrangements will be a matter of secondary importance to the Western Allies, saving our duty to Serbia and Montenegro and their rulers. Russia may not find the German idea of a Polish plus Bohemian border state so very distasteful, provided that the ruler is not a German. Germany may find the idea still tolerable if the ruler is not the Tsar. The destiny of the Serbo-Croatian future lies largely in the hands of Italy and Bulgaria. Bulgaria was not in this war at the beginning, and she may not be in it at the end. Her king is neither immortal nor irreplaceable. Her desire must now be largely to retain her winnings in Macedonia and keep her frontier post of a two-embracing Germany as far off as possible. She has nothing to gain and much to fear from Romania and Greece. Her present revelations with Turkey are unnatural. She has everything to gain from a prompt recovery of the friendship of Italy and the sea powers. A friendly Serbo-Croatian buffer state against Germany will probably be of equal comfort in the future to Italy and Bulgaria, more especially if Italy has pushed down the Adriatic coast along the line of the former Venetian possessions. Serbia has been overrun, but never were the convergent forces of adjacent interests so clearly in favor of her recuperation. The possibility of Italy and that strange Latin outlier, Romania, joining hands through an allied and friendly Serbia must be very present in Italian thought. The Allied conception of the land route from the West and America to Baghdad and India is by Mont Cenis, Trieste, Serbia and Constantinople, as their North European line to India is through Russia by Baku. And that brings us to Constantinople. Constantinople is not a national city. It is now, and it has always been, an artificial cosmopolis, and Constantinople and the Dardanelles are essentially the gate of the Black Sea. It is to Russia that the waterway is of supreme importance. Any other power upon it can strangle Russia. Russia, possessing it, is capable of very little harm to any other country. Romania is the next most interested country, but Romania can reach up to Danube and through Bulgaria, Serbia, or Hungary to the outer world. Her greatest trade will always be with the Central Europe. For generations, the Turks held Thrace and Anatolia before they secured Constantinople. The Turk can exist without Constantinople. He is, at his best, outside Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople was the beginning of his decay. He sat down there and corrupted. His career was at an end. I confess that I find a bias in my mind for a Russian ownership of Constantinople. I think that if she does not get it now, her gravitation towards it in the future will be so great as to cause fresh wars. Somewhere she must get to open sea, and if it is not through Constantinople, then her line must lie either through a dependent Armenia, thrust down to the coast of the Levant, or, least probable and least desirable of all, through the Persian Gulf. The Constantinople route is the most natural and least controversial of these. With the dwindling of the Turkish power, the Turks at Constantinople become more and more like robber knights, levying toll at the pass. I can imagine Russia making enormous concessions in Poland, for example, accepting retrocessions and conceding autonomy, rather than foregoing her ancient destiny upon the Bosphorus. I believe she will fight on along the Black Sea coast until she gets there. This, I think, is Russia's fundamental end, without which no peace is worth having, as the liberation of Belgium and the satisfaction of France is the fundamental end of Great Britain. The Trieste Fiume is the fundamental end of Italy. But for all the lands that lie between Constantinople and West Prussia, there are no absolutely fundamental ends. That is the land of quid pro quo. That is where the dealing will be done. Serbia must be restored and the Croats liberated. Sooner or later, the South Slav state will insist upon itself, but except for that, I see no impossibility in the German dream of three kingdoms to take the place of Austro-Hungary, nor even in a southward extension of the Hohenzollern Empire to embrace the German one of the three. If the Austrians have a passion for Prussian culture, it is not for us to restrain it. Austrian, Saxon, Bavarian, Hanoverian, and Prussian must adjust their own differences. Hungary would be naturally Habsburg, is in fact now essentially Habsburg, more Habsburg than Austria, and essentially anti-Slav. Her gravitation to the Central Powers seem inevitable. Whether the Polish-Czech combination would be a Habsburg kingdom at all is another matter. Only if, after all, the Allies are far less successful than they have now every reason to hope would that become possible. The gravitation of that West Slav state to the Central European system or to Russia will, I think, be the only real measure of ultimate success or failure in this war. I think it narrows down to that, so far as Europe is concerned. Most of the other things are inevitable. Such, it seems to me, is the most open possibility in the European map in the years immediately before us. If by dying I could assure the end of the Hohenzollerns Empire tomorrow, I would gladly do it, but I have, as a balance in profit, to face the high probability of its outliving me for some generations. It is, to me, a deplorable probability. Far rather would I anticipate Germany quit of her eagles and Hohenzollerns, and ready to take her place as the leading power of the United States of Europe. Chapter 10. The United States, France, Britain, and Russia. Section 1. In this chapter, I propose to speculate a little about the future development of these four great states, whose destinies are likely to be much more closely interwoven than their past histories have been. I believe that the stars in their courses tend to draw these states together into a dominant peace alliance, maintaining the peace of the world. There may be other stars in that constellation, Italy, Japan, a confederated Latin America, for example. I do not propose to deal with that possibility now, but only to dwell upon the development of understandings and common aims between France, Russia, and the English-speaking states. They have all shared one common experience during the last 2 years. They have had an enormous loss of self-sufficiency. This has been particularly the case with the United States of America. At the beginning of this war, the United States were still possessed by the glorious illusion that they were aloof from general international politics, that they needed no allies and need fear no enemies, that they constituted a sort of asylum from war and all the bitter stresses and hostilities of the old world. Themselves secure, they could intervene with grim resolution to protect their citizens all over the world. Had they not bombarded Algiers? I remember that soon after the outbreak of the war, I lunched at the Savoy Hotel in London when it was crammed with Americans suddenly swept out of Europe by the storm. My host happened to be a man of some diplomatic standing, and several of them came and talked to him. They were full of these old world ideas of American immunity. Their indignation was comical even at the time. Some of them had been hustled, some had lost their luggage in Germany. When they asked, was it to be returned to them? Some seemed to be under the impression that, war or no war, an American tourist had a perfect right to travel about in the Vosges or up and down the Rhine just as he thought fit. They thought he had just to wave a little American flag and the referee would blow a whistle and hold up the battle until he had got by safely. One family had actually been careering about in a cart, their automobile seized, between the closing lines of French and Germans, brightly unaware of the disrespect of bursting shells for American nationality. Since those days, the American nation has lived politically 100 years. The people of the United States have shed their delusion that there is an Eastern and a Western hemisphere, and that nothing can ever pass between them but immigrants and tourists and trade, and realize that this world is one round globe and gets smaller and smaller every decade if you measure it by days' journeys. They are only going over the lesson the British have learnt in the last score or so of years. This is one world, and bayonets are a crop that spreads. Let them gather and seed. It matters not how far from you, and a time will come when they will be sticking up under your nose. There is no real peace but the peace of the whole world, and that is only to be kept by the whole world resisting and suppressing aggression wherever it arises. To anyone who watches the American press, this realization has been more and more manifest. From dreams of aloofness and ineffable superiority, America comes round very rapidly to a conception of an active participation in the difficult business of statecraft. She is thinking of alliances, of throwing her weight and influence upon the side of law and security. No longer a political Thoreau in the woods, a sort of vegetation recluse among nations, a being of negative virtues and unpremeditated superiorities, she girds herself for a manly part in the toilsome world of men. So far as I can judge, the American mind is eminently free from any sentimental leaning towards the British. Americans have a traditional hatred of the Hanoverian monarchy and a democratic disbelief in autocracy. They are far more acutely aware of differences than resemblances. They suspect every Englishman of being a bit of a gentleman and a bit of a flunky. I have never found in America anything like that feeling common in the mass of English people that prevents the use of the word foreigner for an American. There is nothing to reciprocate the sympathy and pride that English and Irish Republicans and radicals feel for the States. Few Americans realize that there are such beings as English Republicans. What has linked Americans with the British hitherto has been very largely the common language and literature. It is only since the war began that there seems to have been any appreciable development of fraternal feeling. And that has been not so much discovery of a mutual affection as the realization of a far closer community of essential thought and purpose than has hitherto been suspected. The Americans, after thinking the matter out with great frankness and vigour, do believe that Britain is on the whole fighting against aggression and not for profit, that she is honestly backing France and Belgium against an intolerable attack, and that the Hohenzollern Empire is a thing that needs discrediting and, if possible, destroying in the interest of all humanity, Germany included. America has made the surprising discovery that, allowing for their greater nearness, the British are thinking about these things almost exactly as Americans think about them. They follow the phases of the war in Great Britain, the strain, the blunderings, the tenacity, the onset of conscription on an essentially non-military community with a complete understanding of a people similarly circumstanced, differing only by scale and distance. They have been through something of the sort already. They may have something of the sort happen again. It had not occurred to them hitherto how parallel we are. They begin to have inklings of how much more parallel we may presently become. There is evidence of a real search for American affinities among the other people of the world. It is a new war-made feature of the thoughtful literature and journalists of America, and it is interesting to note how partial and divided these affinities must necessarily be. Historically and politically, the citizen of the United States must be drawn most closely to France. France is one other successful modern republic. She was the instigator and friend of American liberation. With Great Britain, the tie of language, the tradition of personal freedom, and the strain of the blood are powerful links. But both France and Britain are old countries, thickly populated with a great and ancient finish and completeness, full of implicit relationships. America is by comparison crude, uninformed, explicit, a new country, still turning fresh soil, still turning over but half-explored natural resources. The United States constitutes a modern country, a country on an unprecedented scale, being organized from the very beginning of modern lines. There is only one other such country upon the planet, and that, curiously enough, is parallel in climate, size, and position: Russia in Asia. Even Russia in Europe belongs rather to the newness that is American than to the tradition that is European. Harvard was founded more than half a century before Petrograd, and when I looked out of the train window on my way to Petrograd from Germany, the little towns I saw were like no European towns I had ever seen. The wooden houses, the broad, unmade roads, the traffic, the winter-bitten scenery, a sort of untidy spaciousness took my mind instantly to the country one sees in the back part of New York State as one goes from Boston to Niagara, and the reality follows the appearance. The United States and Russia are the west and the east of the same thing. They are great modern states, developing from the beginning upon a scale that only railways make possible. France and Britain may perish in the next 2 centuries, or they may persist. But there can be no doubt that 2 centuries ahead, Russia and the United States will be 2 of the greatest masses of fairly homogeneous population on the globe. There are no countries with whom the people of the United States are so likely to develop sympathy and a sense of common values and common interests as with these 3, unless it will be with the Scandinavian peoples. The Scandinavian peoples have developed a tendency to an extra-European outlook, to look west and east rather than southwardly, to be pacifists and progressive in a manner essentially American. From any close sympathy with Germany, the Americans are cut off at present by the Hohenzollern and the system of ideas that the Hohenzollerns have imposed upon German thought. So long as the Germans cling to the tawdry tradition of the empire, so long as they profess militarism, so long as they keep up their ridiculous belief in some strange racial superiority to the rest of mankind, it is absurd to expect any cooperative feeling between them and any other great people. The American tradition is based upon the casting off of a Germanic monarchy. It is its cardinal idea. These sturdy Republicans did not fling out of the Hanoverians and their Hessian troops to prepare the path of glory for Potsdam. But except for the gash caused by the Teutonic monarchy, there runs round the whole world a North temperament and subarctic zone of peoples generally similar in complexion, physical circumstances, and intellectual and moral quality, having enormous undeveloped natural resources and a common interest in keeping the peace while these natural resources are developed, having also a common interest in maintaining the integrity of China and preventing her development into a military power. It is a zone with the clearest prospect of a vast increase in its already enormous population, and it speaks in the main one or other of 3 languages, either French, Russian, or English. I believe that natural sympathy will march with the obvious possibilities of the situation in bringing the American mind to the realization of this band of common interests and of its compatibility with the older idea of an American continent protected by a Monroe Doctrine from any possibility of aggression from the monarchies of the Old World. As the old conception of isolation fades and the American mind accustoms itself to the new conception of a need of alliances and understandings to save mankind from the megalomania of races and dynasties, I believe it will turn first to the idea of keeping the seas with Britain and France, and then to this still wider idea of an understanding with the pledged allies that will keep the peace of the world. Now, Germany has taught the world several things, and one of the most important of these lessons is the fact that the destinies of states and peoples is no longer to be determined by the secret arrangements of diplomatists and the agreements or jealousies of kings. For 50 years, Germany has been unifying the mind of her people against the world. She has obsessed them with an evil ideal, but the point we have to note is that she has succeeded in obsessing them with that ideal. No other modern country has even attempted such a moral and mental solidarity as Germany has achieved. And good ideals need, just as much as bad ones, systematic inculcation, continual open expression, and restatement. Mute, mindless, or demented nations are dangerous and doomed nations. The great political conceptions that are needed to establish the peace of the world must become the common property of the mass of intelligent adults if they are to hold against the political scoundrel, the royal adventurer, the forensic exploiter, the enemies and scatterers of mankind. The French, Americans, and English have to realize this necessity. They have to state a common will, and they have to make their possession by that which will be understood by the Russian people, and they have to share that will with the Russian people. Beyond that, there lies the still greater task of making some common system of understandings with the intellectual masses of China and India. At present, with three of these four great powers enormously preoccupied with actual warfare, there is an opportunity for guiding expression on the part of America for a real-world leadership, such as may never occur again. So far as I have been stating a situation and reviewing certain possibilities, in the past half-century the United States has been developing a great system of universities and a continental production of literature and discussion to supplement the limited press and the New England literature of the earlier phase of the American process. It is one of the most interesting speculations in the world to everyone how far this new organization of the American mind is capable of grasping the stupendous opportunities and appeals of the present time. The war and the great occasions that must follow the war will tax the mind and the intellectual and moral forces of the pledged allies enormously. How far is this new but very great and growing system of thought and learning in the United States capable of that propaganda of ideas and language, that progressive expression of a developing ideal of community, that in countries so spontaneous, so chaotic or democratic as the United States and the pledged allies, must necessarily take the place of the organized authoritative culture of the Teutonic type of state? As an undisguisedly patriotic Englishman, I would like to see the lead in this intellectual synthesis of the nations that must be achieved if wars are to cease, undertaken by Great Britain. But I am bound to confess that in Great Britain, I see neither the imaginative courage of France nor the brisk enterprise of the Americans. I see this matter as a question of peace and civilization, but there are other baser but quite as effective reasons why America, France, and Great Britain should exert themselves to create confidences and understandings between their populations and the Russian population. There is the immediate business opportunity in Russia. There is the secondary business opportunity in China that can best be developed as a partner rather than as the rivals of the Russians. Since the Americans are nearest, by way of the Pacific, since they are likely to have more capital and more free energy to play with than the pledged allies, I do on the whole incline the belief that it is they who will yet do the pioneer work and the leading work that this opportunity demands. Section 2. If beneath the alliances of the present war there is to grow up a system of enduring understandings that will lead to the peace of the world, there is needed a basis for such understandings, much greater facility of intellectual intercourse than exists at present. Firstly, the world needs a lingua franca. Next, the Western peoples need to know more of the Russian language and life than they do. And thirdly, the English language needs to be made more easily accessible than it is at present. The chief obstacle to a Frenchman or Englishman learning Russian is the difficult and confusing alphabet. The chief obstacle to anyone learning English is the irrational spelling. Are people likely to overcome these very serious difficulties in the future? And if so, how will they do it? And what prospects are there of a lingua franca? Wherever one looks closely into the causes and determining influences of the great convulsions of this time, one is more and more impressed by the apparent smallness of the ultimate directing influence. It seems to me, at least, that it is a practically proven thing that this vast aggression of Germany is to be traced back to a general tone of court thinking and discussion in the Prussia of the 18th century, to the theories of a few professors and the gathering trend of German education in a certain direction. It seems to me that similarly, the language teachers of today and tomorrow may hold in their hands the seeds of gigantic international developments in the future. It is not a question of the skill or devotion of individual teachers, so much as of the possibility of organizing them upon a grand scale. An individual teacher must necessarily use the ordinary books and ordinary spelling and type of the language in which he is given instruction. He may get a few elementary instruction books from a private publisher, specially printed for teaching purposes, but very speedily he finds himself obliged to go to the current printed matter. This, as I will immediately show, bars the most rapid and fruitful method of teaching. And in this, as in most affairs, private enterprise, the individualistic system shows itself a failure. In England, for example, the choice of Russian lesson books is poor and unsatisfactory, and there is either no serviceable Russian English to Russian school dictionary in existence, or it is published so badly that it is beyond the range of my inquiries. But a state or a group of universities, or even a rich private association such as Farsi and American, French and British businessmen might be reasonably expected to form, could attack the problem of teaching a language in an altogether different fashion. The difficulty in teaching English lies in the inconsistency of the spelling and the consequent difficulties of pronunciation. If there were available an ample series of textbooks, reading books, and books of general interest, done in a consistent phonetic type and spelling, in which the value of the letters of the phonetic system followed as far as possible the prevalent usage in Europe, the difficulty in teaching English not merely to foreigners, but, as the experiments in teaching reading of the Simplified Spelling Society have proved up to the hilt, the English children can be very greatly reduced. At first, the difficulty of the irrational spelling can be set on one side. The learner attacks and masters the essential language. Then afterwards he can, if he likes, go on to the orthodox spelling, which is then no harder for him to read and master than it is for an Englishman of ordinary education to read the facetious orthography of Artemus Ward or of the Westminster Gazette, Office Boy. The learner does one thing at a time instead of attempting, as he would otherwise have to do, two things, and they are both difficult and different and conflicting things simultaneously. Learning a language is one thing, and memorizing an illogical system of visual images, for that is what reading ordinary English spelling comes to, is quite another. A man can learn to play first chess, and then bridge in half the time that these two games would require if he began by attempting simultaneous play, and exactly the same principle applies to the language problem. These considerations led on to the idea of a special development or subspecies of the English language for elementary teaching and foreign consumption. It would be English, very slightly simplified and regularized and phonetically spelt. Let us call it Anglo-American. In it, the propagandist power, whatever that power might be, state, university or association, would print not simply instruction books but a literature of cheap editions. Such a specialized, simplified Anglo-American variety of English would enormously stimulate the already wide diffusion of the language and go far to establish it as that lingua franca of which the world has need. And in the same way, the phonetic alphabet adopted as the English medium could be used as the medium for instruction in French, where, as in the British Isles, Canada, North and Central Africa, and large regions of the East, it is desirable to make an English-speaking community bilingual. At present, a book in English means nothing to an uninstructed Englishman. An English book conveys no accurate sound images to an uninstructed Frenchman. On the other hand, a French book printed on a proper phonetic system could be immediately read aloud, though of course it could not be understood by an uninstructed Englishman. From the first, he would have no difficulties with the sounds, and vice versa. Such a system of books would mean the destruction of what are, for great masses of French and English people, insurmountable difficulties on the way to bilingualism. Its production is a task all too colossal for any private publishers or teachers, but it is a task altogether trivial in comparison with the national value of its consequences. But whether it will ever be carried out is just one of those riddles of the jumping cat in the human brain that are most perplexing to the prophet. The problem becomes at once graver, less hopeful, and more urgent when we take up the case of Russian. I have looked closely into this business of Russian teaching, and I am convinced that only a very, very small number of French and English-speaking people are going to master Russian under the existing conditions of instruction. If we Westerns want to get at Russia in good earnest, we must take up this Russian language problem with an imaginative courage and upon a scale of which at present I see no signs. If we do not, then the Belgians, French, Americans, and English will be doing business in Russia after the war in the German language, or through a friendly German interpreter. That, I am afraid, is the probability of the case. But it need not be the case. Will and intelligence could alter all that. What has to be done is to have Russian taught at first in a Western phonetic type. Then it becomes a language not very much more difficult to acquire than, say, German by a Frenchman. When the learner can talk with some freedom, has a fairly full vocabulary, a phraseology, knows his verb and so on, then and then only should he take up the unfamiliar and confusing set of visual images of Russian lettering. I speak from the point of view of those who read the Latin alphabet. How confusing it may be. Only those who have tried it can tell. Its familiarity to the eye increases the difficulty. Totally unfamiliar forms would be easier to learn. The Frenchman or Englishman is confronted with cop. The sound of that is sa. For those who learn languages, as so many people do nowadays, by visual images, there will always be an undercurrent towards saying cop. The mind plunges hopelessly through that tangle to the elements of a speech which is as yet unknown. Nevertheless, almost all the instruction in Russian of which I can get an account begins with the alphabet, and must, I suppose, begin with the alphabet until teachers have a suitably printed set of instruction books to enable them to take the better line. One school teacher I know in a public school devoted the entire first term, the third of a year, to the alphabet. At the end, he was still dissatisfied with the progress of his pupils. He gave them Russian words, of course, words of which they knew nothing, in Russian characters. It was too much for them to take hold of at one and the same time. He did not even think of teaching them to write French and English words in the strange lettering. He did not attempt to write his Russian in Latin words. He was apparently ignorant of any system of transliteration, and he did nothing to mitigate the impossible task before him. At the end of the term, most of his pupils gave up the hopeless effort. It is not too much to say that for a great number of visualizing people, the double effort of the outset of Russian is entirely too much. It stops them altogether, but to almost anyone, it is possible to learn Russian if at first it is presented in a lettering that gives no trouble. If I found myself obliged to learn Russian urgently, I would get some accepted system of transliteration, carefully transcribe every word of Russian in my textbook into the Latin characters, and learn the elements of the language from my manuscript. A year or so ago, I made a brief visit to Russia with a Russian self-taught in my pocket. Nothing sticks, nothing ever did stick, of that self-taught Russian except the words that I learnt in Latin type. Those I remember as I remember all words as groups of Latin letters. I learnt to count, for example, up to 100. The other day I failed to recognize the Russian word for 11 in Russian characters until I had spelt it out. Then I said, "Oh, of course," but I knew it when I heard it. I write of these things from the point of view of the keen learner. Some Russian teachers will be found to agree with me, others will not. It is a paradox in the psychology of the teacher that few teachers are willing to adopt slick methods of teaching. They hate cutting corners far more than they hate obstacles, because their interest is in the teaching and not in the getting there. But what we learners want is not an exquisite, rare knowledge of particulars. We do not want to spend an hour upon Russian needlessly. We want to get there as quickly and effectively as possible. And for that, transliterated books are essential. Now, these may seem small details in the learning of languages, mere schoolmaster's gossip, but the consequences are on the continental scale. The want of these national textbooks and readers is a great gulf between Russia and her allies. It is a greater gulf than the profoundest political misunderstanding could be. We cannot get at them to talk plainly to them, and they cannot get at us to talk plainly to us. A narrow bridge of interpreters is our only link with the Russian mind. And many of those interpreters are of a race which is, for very good reasons, hostile to Russia. An abundant cheap supply, firstly, of English and French books, in English and French, but in the Russian character, by means of which Russians may rapidly learn French and English, for it is quite a fable that these languages are known and used in Russia below the level of the court and aristocracy, and secondly, of Russian books in the Latin or some easy phonetic development of the Latin type will do more to facilitate interchange and intercourse between Russia and France, America and Britain, and so consolidate the present alliance than almost any other single thing. But that supply will not be a paying thing to provide. If it is left to publishers or private language teachers or any form of private enterprise, it will never be provided. It is a necessary public undertaking. But because a thing is necessary, it does not follow that it will be achieved. Bread may be necessary to a starving man, but there is always the alternative that he will starve. France, which is most accessible to creative ideas, is least interested in this particular matter. Great Britain is still heavily conservative. It is idle to ignore the forces still entrenched in the established church, in the universities and the great schools that stand for an irrational resistance to all new things. American universities are comparatively youthful and sometimes quite surprisingly innovating. And America is the country of the adventurous millionaire. There has been evidence in several American papers that have reached me recently of a disposition to get ahead with Russia and cut out the Germans and incidentally the British. Amidst the cross-currents and overlappings of this extraordinary time, it seems to me highly probable that America may lead this vitally important effort to promote international understanding. Chapter 11. The White Man's Burthen. One of the most curious aspects of the British pacifist is his willingness to give over great blocks of the black and coloured races to the Hohenzollern to exploit and experiment upon. I myself being something of a pacifist and doing what I can in my corner to bring about the peace of the world triumphant and armed against every disturber, could the more readily sympathise with the passive school of pacifists if its proposals involved the idea that England should keep to England and Germany to Germany. My political ideal is the United States of the world, a union of states whose state boundaries are determined by what I have defined as the natural map of mankind. I cannot understand those pacifists who talk about the German right to expansion and babble about a return of her justly lost colonies. That seems to me not pacifism but patriotic inversion. This large disposition to hand over our fellow creatures to a Teutonic educational system with frightfulness in reserve, to efficiency on Wittenberg lines, leaves me hot. The ghosts of the thirst-tormented heroes rise up in their thousands from the African dust, protesting. This talk of legitimate expansion is indeed now only an exploiter's cant. The age of expansion, the age of European empires, is near its end. No one who can read the signs of the times in Japan, in India, in China can doubt it. It ended in America 100 years ago. It is ending now in Asia. It will end last in Africa, and even in Africa, the end draws near. Spain has but led the way. Which other empires must follow? Look at her empire in the atlases of 1800. She fell down the steps violently and painfully. It is true, but they are difficult to descend. No sane man, German or anti-German, who has weighed the prospects of the new age will be desirous of a restoration of the now vanished German colonial empire, vindictive, intriguing, and unscrupulous, a mere series of centres of attack upon adjacent territory to complicate the immense disentanglements and readjustments that lie already before the French and British and Italians. Directly, we discussed the problem of the absolutely necessary permanent alliance that this war has forced upon at least France, Belgium, Britain, and Russia. This problem of the empires faces us. What are these allies going to do about their subject races? What is the world going to do about the subject races? It is a matter in which the subject races are likely to have an increasingly important voice of their own. We Europeans may discuss their fate today among ourselves. We shall be discussing it with them tomorrow. If we do not agree with them, then they will take their fates in their own hands in spite of us. Long before AD 2100, there will be no such thing as a subject race in all the world. Here again we find ourselves asking just that same difficult question of more or less that arises at every cardinal point of our review of the probable future. How far is this thing going to be done finely? How far is it going to be done cunningly and basely? How far will greatness of mind, how far will imaginative generosity prevail over the jealous and pettifogging spirit that lurks in every human being? Are French and British and Belgians and Italians, for example, going to help each other in Africa? Or are they going to work against and cheat each other? Is the Russian seeking only a necessary outlet of the sea of the world, or has he dreams of Delhi? Here again, as in all these questions, personal idiosyncrasy comes in. I am strongly disposed to trust the good in the Russian. But apart from this uncertain question of generosity, there are in this case two powerful forces that make against disputes, secret disloyalties, and meanness. One is that Germany will certainly be still dangerous at the end of the war, and the second is that the gap in education, in efficiency, in national feeling and courage of outlook between the European and the greater Asiatic and African communities is rapidly diminishing. If the Europeans squabble much more for world ascendancy, there will be no world ascendancy for them to squabble for. We have still no means of measuring the relative enfeeblement of Europe in comparison with Asia already produced by this war. As it is, certain things are so inevitable. The integration of the modernized Bengal, of China and of Egypt, for example, that the question before us is practically reduced to whether this restoration of the subject peoples will be done with the Europeans' aid and goodwill, or whether it will be done against them. That it will be done in some manner or other is certain. The days of suppression are over. They know it in every country where white and brown and yellow mingle. If the pledged allies are not disposed to let in light to their subject peoples and prepare for the days of world equality that are coming, the Germans will. If the Germans fail to be the most enslaving of people, they may become the most liberating. They will set themselves, with their characteristic thoroughness, to destroy that magic prestige which in Asia particularly is the clue to the miracle of European ascendancy. In the long run, that may prove no ill service to mankind. The European must prepare to make himself acceptable in Asia, to state his case to Asia and be understood by Asia, or to leave Asia. That is the blunt reality of the Asiatic situation. It has already been pointed out in these chapters that if the alliance of the pledged allies is indeed to be permanent, it implies something in the nature of a zollverein, a common policy towards the rest of the world, and an arrangement involving a common control over the dependencies of all the allies. It will be interesting now that we have sketched a possible map of Europe after the war to look a little more closely into the nature of the empires concerned, and to attempt a few broad details of a probable map of the Eastern Hemisphere outside Europe in the years immediately to come. Now, there are, roughly speaking, three types of overseas possessions. There may be either 1. Territory that was originally practically unoccupied and that was settled by the imperial people, or 2. Territory with a barbaric population having no national idea, or 3. Conquered states. In the case of the British Empire, all three are present. In the case of the French, only the second and third. In the case of the Russian, only the first and third. Each of these types must necessarily follow its own system of developments. Take first those territories originally but thinly occupied, or not occupied at all, of which all, or at least the dominant element of the population, is akin to that of the home country. These used to be called by the British colonies, though the colonies of Greece and Rome were really only garrison cities settled in foreign lands, and they are now being rechristened dominions. Australia, for instance, is a British dominion, and Siberia and most of Russia in Asia a Russian dominion. Their manifest destiny is for their children to become equal citizens with the cousins and brothers they have left at home. There has been much discussion in England during the last decade upon some modification of the British legislature that would admit representatives from the dominions to a proportionment of the empire. The problem has been complicated by the unsettled status of Ireland and the mischief-making Tories there, and by the perplexities arising out of those British dependencies of non-British race, the Indian states, for example, whose interests are sometimes in conflict with those of the dominions. The attractiveness of the idea of an imperial legislature is chiefly on the surface, and I have very strong doubts of its realizability. These dominions seem rather to tend to become independent and distinct sovereign states in close and affectionate alliance with Great Britain, and having a common interest in the British Navy. In many ways, the interests of the dominions are more divergent from those of Great Britain than are Great Britain and Russia, or Great Britain and France. Many of the interests of Canada are more closely bound to those of the United States than they are to those of Australasia, in such a matter as the maintenance of the Monroe Principle, for example. South Africa again takes a line with regard to British Indian subjects, which is highly embarrassing to Great Britain. There is a tendency in all the British colonies to read American books and periodicals rather than British, if for no other reason than because their common life in a newish and very democratic land, is much more American than British in character. On the other hand, one must remember that Great Britain has European interests. The integrity of Holland and Belgium is a case in point, which are much closer to the interests of France than they are to those of the younger Britons beyond the seas. A voice in an alliance that included France and the United States, and had its chief common interest in the control of the seas, may in the future seem far more desirable to these great and growing English-speaking dominions than the sending of representatives to an imperial House of Lords at Westminster, and the adornment of elderly colonial politicians with titles and decorations at Buckingham Palace. I think Great Britain and her allies have all of them to prepare their minds for a certain release of their grip upon their possessions if they wish to build up a larger unity. I do not see that any secure unanimity of purpose is possible without such releases and readjustments. Now, the next class of foreign possession is that in which the French and Belgians and Italians are most interested. Britain also has possessions of this type in Central Africa and the less civilized districts of India, but Russia has scarcely anything of the sort. In this second class of possession, the population is numerous, barbaric, and incapable of any large or enduring political structure, and over its destinies rule a small minority of European administrators. The greatest of this series of possessions are those in Black Africa. The French imagination has taken a very strong hold of the idea of a great French-speaking West and Central Africa, with which the ordinary British citizen will only too gladly see the conquered German colonies incorporated. The Italians have a parallel field of development in the hinterland of Tripoli. Side by side, France, Belgium, and Italy, no longer troubled by hostile intrigues, may very well set themselves in the future to the task of building up a congenial Latin civilization out of the tribal confusions of these vast regions. They will, I am convinced, do far better than the English in this domain. The English-speaking peoples have been perhaps the most successful settlers in the world. The United States and the Dominions are there to prove it. Only the Russians in Siberia can compare with them, but as administrators, the British are a race coldly aloof. They have nothing to give to black people and no disposition to give. The Latin-speaking peoples, the Mediterranean nations, on the other hand, have proved to be the most successful assimilators of other races that mankind has ever known. Alexandre Dumas is not the least of the glories of France. In 100 years' time, Black Africa, west of Tripoli, from Oran to Rhodesia, will, I believe, talk French. And what does not speak French will speak the closely related Italian. I do not see why this Latin black culture should not extend across equatorial Africa to meet the Indian influence at the coast, and reach out to join hands with Madagascar. I do not see why the British flag should be any impediment to the Latinization of tropical Africa or to the natural extension of the French and Italian languages through Egypt. I guess, however, that it will be an Islamic and not a Christian cult that will be talking Italian and French. For the French-speaking civilization will make roads not only for French, Belgians, and Italians, but for the Arabs whose religion and culture already lie a net over Black Africa. No other peoples and no other religion can so conveniently give the Negro what is needed. A few words of digression upon the future of Islam may not be out of place here. The idea of a militant Christendom had vanished from the world. The last pretensions of Christian propaganda have been buried in Balkan trenches. A unification of Africa under Latin auspices carries with it now no threat of missionary invasion. Africa will be a fair field for all religions, and the religion to which the Negro will take will be the religion that best suits his needs. That religion, we are told by nearly everyone who has a right to speak upon such questions, is Islam, and its natural propagandist is the Arab. There is no reason why he should not be a Frenchified Arab. Both the French and the British have the strongest interest in the revival of Arabic culture. Let the German learn Turkish if it pleases him. Through all Africa and Western Asia, there is a great tomorrow for a Renaissance Islam under Arab auspices. Constantinople, that venal city of the waterways, sitting like Asnath at the ford, has corrupted all who came to her. She has been the paralysis of Islam. But the Islam of the Turk is a different thing from the Islam of the Arab. That was one of the great progressive impulses in the world of men. It is our custom to underrate the Arab's contribution to civilization quite absurdly in comparison with our debt to the Hebrew and the Greek. It is the initiatives of Islamic culture, for example, that we owe our numerals, the bulk of modern mathematics, and the science of chemistry. The British have already set themselves to the establishment of Islamic university teaching in Egypt, but that is the mere first stroke of the pick at the opening of the mine. English, French, Russian, Arabic, Hindustani, Spanish, Italian, These are the great world languages that most concern the future of civilization from the point of view of the peace alliance that impends. No country can afford to neglect any of those languages, but as a matter of primary importance, I would say for the British, Hindustani, for the Americans, Russian or Spanish, for the French and Belgians and Italians, Arabic. These are the directions in which the duty of understanding is most urgent for each of these peoples, and the path of opportunity plainest. The disposition to underrate temporarily depressed nations, races, and cultures is a most irrational, prevalent, and mischievous form of stupidity. It distorts our entire outlook towards the future. The British reader can see its absurdity most easily when he reads the ravings of some patriotic German about the superiority of the Teuton over the Italians and Greeks, to whom we owe most things of importance in European civilization. Equally silly stuff is still to be read in British and American books about Asiatics. And was there not some fearful rubbish, not only in German but in English and French, about the decadence of France? But we are learning rapidly. When I was a student in London 30 years ago, we regarded Japan as a fantastic joke. The comic opera, The Mikado, still preserves that foolish phase for the admiration of posterity. And today there is a quite unjustifiable tendency to ignore the quality of the Arab and of his religion. Islam is an open-air religion, noble and simple in its broad conceptions. It is none the less vital from Nigeria to China because it had sickened in the closeness of Constantinople. The French, the Italians, the British have to reckon with Islam and the Arab. Where the continental deserts are, there the Arabs are, and there is Islam. Their culture will never be destroyed and replaced over these regions by Europeanism. The allies who prepare the peace of the world have to make their peace with that. And when I foreshadow this necessary liaison of the French and Arabic cultures, I am thinking not only of the Arab that is, but of the Arab that is to come. The whole trend of events in Asia Minor, the breaking up and decapitation of the Ottoman Empire and the Euphrates invasion, points to a great revival of Mesopotamia, at first under European direction. The vast system of irrigation that was destroyed by the Mongol armies of Hulagu in the 13th century will be restored. The desert will again become populous, but the local type will prevail. The new population of Mesopotamia will be neither European nor Indian. It will be Arabic, and with its concentration Arabic, will lay hold of the printing press. A new intellectual movement in Islam, a Renaissance Baghdad, is as inevitable as is 1950. I have, however, gone a little beyond the discussion of the future of the barbaric possessions in these anticipations of an Arabic cooperation with the Latin peoples in the reconstruction of Western Asia and the barbaric regions of North and Central Africa. But regions of administered barbarism occur not only in Africa. The point is that they are administered and that their economic development is very largely in the hands, and will for many generations remain in the hands of the possessing country. Hitherto their administration has been in the interests of the possessing nation alone. Their acquisition has been a matter of bitter rivalries. Their continued administration upon exclusive lines is bound to lead to dangerous clashings. The common sense of the situation points to a policy of give and take, in which throughout the possessions of all the pledged allies, the citizens of all will have more or less equal civil advantages, and this means some consolidation for the general control of those administered territories. I have already hinted at the possibility that the now exclusively British Navy may someday be a world navy controlled by an admiralty representing a group of allies, Australasia, Canada, Britain, and it may be France and Russia and the United States. To those who know how detached the British Admiralty is at the present time from the general methods of British political life, there will be nothing strange in this idea of its completer detachment. Its personnel does to a large extent constitute a class apart. It takes its boys out of the general life very often before they have got to their 14th birthday. It is not so closely linked up with specific British social elements, with political parties and the general educational system, as are the rest of the national services. There is nothing so very fantastic in this idea of a sort of world admiralty. It is not even completely novel. Such bodies as the Knights Templars transcended nationality in the Middle Ages. I do not see how some such synthetic control of the seas is to be avoided in the future. And now, coming back to the white man's burden, is there not a possibility that such a board of marine and international control as the naval and international problems of the future may produce, or some closely parallel body with a stronger Latin element, would also be capable of dealing with these barbaric, administered territories? A day may come when Tripoli, Nigeria, the French and the Belgian Congo will be all under one supreme control. We may be laying the foundations of such a system today unawares. The unstable and fluctuating conferences of the Allies today, their repeated experiences of the disadvantages of evanescent and discontinuous coordinations, may press them almost unconsciously toward this building up of things greater than they know. We come now to the third and most difficult type of overseas possessions. These are the annexed or conquered regions with settled populations already having a national tradition and culture of their own. They are, to put it bluntly, the suppressed, the overlaid nations. Now, I am a writer rather prejudiced against the idea of nationality. My habit of thought is cosmopolitan. I hate and despise a shrewish suspicion of foreigners and foreign ways. A man who can look at me in the face, laugh with me, speak truth and deal fairly is my brother, though his skin is as black as ink or as yellow as an evening primrose. But I have to recognize the facts of the case. In spite of all my large liberality, I find it less irritating to be ruled by people of my own language and race and tradition, and I perceive that for the mass of people alien rule is intolerable. Local difference, nationality, is a very obstinate thing. Every country tends to revert to its natural type. Once a people has emerged above the barbaric stage to a national consciousness, that consciousness will endure. There is practically always going to be an Egypt, a Poland, an Armenia. There is no Indian nation. There never has been, but there are manifestly a Bengal and a Rajputana. There is manifestly a constellation of civilized nations in India. Several of these have literatures and traditions that extend back before the days when the Britons painted themselves with woad. Let us deal with this question mainly with reference to India. What is said will apply equally to Burma or Egypt or Armenia, or, to come back to Europe, Poland. Now, I have talked, I suppose, with many scores of people about the future of India, and I have never yet met anyone, Indian or British, who thought it desirable that the British should evacuate India at once. And I have never yet met anyone who did not think that, ultimately, the British must let the Indian nations control their own destinies. There are really not two opposite opinions about the destiny of India, but only differences of opinion as to the length of time in which that destiny is to be achieved. Many Indians think, and I agree with them, that India might be a confederation of sovereign states in close alliance with the British Empire and its allies within the space of 50 years or so. The opposite extreme was expressed by an old weary Indian administrator who told me, perhaps they may begin to be capable of self-government in 400 or 500 years. These are the extreme liberal and the extreme Tory positions in this question. It is a choice between decades and centuries. There is no denial of the inevitability of ultimate restoration. No one of any experience believes the British administration in India is an eternal institution. There is a great deal of cant in this matter in Great Britain. Genteel English people with relations in the Indian civil service and habits of self-delusion believe that Indians are grateful for British rule. a sort of patriotic self-flattery that prevailed in the Victorian age and which is so closely akin to contemporary German follies, fostered and cultivated this sweet delusion. There are, no doubt, old ladies in Germany today who believe that Belgium will presently be grateful for the present German administration. Let us clear our minds of such cant. As a matter of fact, no Indians really like British rule or think of it as anything better than a necessary, temporary evil. Let me put the parallel case to an Englishman or a Frenchman. Through various political ineptitudes, our country has, we will suppose, fallen under the rule of the Chinese. They administer it, we will further assume, with an efficiency and honesty unparalleled in the bad old times of our lawyer politicians. They do not admit us to the higher branches of the administration. They go about our country wearing a strange costume, professing a strange religion, which implies that ours is wrong, speaking an unfamiliar tongue. They control our financial system and our economic development on Chinese lines of the highest merit. They take the utmost care of our Gothic cathedrals for us. They put our dear racial possessions into museums and admire them very much indeed. They teach our young men to fly kites and eat bird's nest soup. They do all that a well-bred people can do to conceal their habit and persuasion of a racial superiority. But they keep up their prestige. We shouldn't love them. It really isn't a question of whether they rule well or ill, but that the position is against certain fundamentals of human nature. The only possible footing upon which we could meet them with comfortable minds would be the footing that we and they were discussing the terms of the restoration of our country. Then indeed we might almost feel friendly with them. That is the case with all civilized possessions. The only terms upon which educated British and Indians can meet today with any comfort is precisely that. The living intercourse of the British and Indian mind today is the discussion of the restoration. Everything else is humbug on the one side and self-deception on the other. It is idle to speak of the British occupation in India as a conquest or a robbery. It is a fashion of much advanced literature in Europe to assume that the European rule of various Asiatic countries is the result of deliberate conquest with a view to spoliation. But that is only the ugly side of the facts. Cases of the deliberate invasion and spoliation of one country by another have been very rare in the history of the last 3 centuries. There has always been an excuse, and there has always been a percentage of truth in the excuse. The history of every country contains phases of political ineptitude in which that country becomes so misgoverned as to be not only a nuisance to the foreigner within its borders, but a danger to its neighbors. Mexico is in such a phase today, and most of the aggressions and annexations of the modern period have arisen out of the inconveniences and reasonable fears caused by such an inept phase. I am a persistent advocate for the restoration of Poland, but at the same time it is very plain to me that it is a mere travesty of the facts to say that Poland was a white lamb of a country torn to pieces by 3 wicked neighbours. Poland in the 18th century was a dangerous political muddle, uncertain of her monarchy, her policy, her affinities. She endangered her neighbours because there was no guarantee that she might not fall under the tutelage of one of them and become a weapon against the others. The division of Poland was an outrage for the Polish people, but it was largely dictated by an entirely honest desire to settle a dangerous possibility. It seemed less injurious than the possibility of a vacillating, independent Poland playing off one neighbour against another. That possibility will still be present in the minds of the diplomatists who will determine the settlement after the war, until the Poles make up their minds and either convince the Russians that they are on the side of Russia and Bohemia against Germany forevermore, or the Germans that they are willing to be poisoned. They will live between 2 distrustful enemies. The Poles need to think of the future more and the wrongs of Poland less. They want less patriotic intrigue and more racial self-respect. They are not only Poles but members of a greater brotherhood. My impression is that Poland will go Slav in spite of Krakow, but I am not sure. I am haunted by the fear that Poland may still find her future hampered by Poles who are, as people say, too clever by half. An incalculable Poland cannot be and will not be tolerated by the rest of Europe. And the overspreading of India by the British was in the same way very clearly done under compulsion. First, lest the Dutch or French should exploit the vast resources of the peninsula against Britain, and then for fear of a Russian exploitation. I am no apologist for British rule in India. I think we have neglected vast opportunities there. It was our business from the outset to build up a free and friendly Indian confederation, and we have done not a tithe of what we might have done to that end. But then we have not done a little of what we might have done for our own country. Nevertheless, we have our case to plead, not only for going to India, but with the Berlin papers still babbling of Baghdad and beyond, of sticking there very grimly. And so too, the British have a fairly sound excuse for grabbing Egypt in their fear, lest in its phase of political ineptitude it should be the means of strangling the British Empire as the Turk in Constantinople has been used to strangle the Russian. None of these justifications, I admit, are complete, but all deserve consideration. It is no good arguing about the finer ethics of the things that are. The business of sane men is to get things better. The business of all sane men in all the countries of the pledged allies and in America is manifestly to sink petty jealousies and the suicidal competitiveness, and to organize cooperation with all the intellectual forces they can find or develop in the subject countries to convert these inept national systems into politically efficient independent organizations in a world peace alliance. If we fail to do that, then all the inept states and all the subject states about the world will become one great field for the sowing of tares by the enemy. Footnote 3. This was written late in February 1916. So that with regard to the civilized, just as with regard to the barbaric regions of the possessions of the European-centered empires, we come to the same conclusion, that on the whole, the path of safety lies in the direction of pooling them and of declaring a common policy of progressive development leading to equality. The pattern of the United States, in which the procedure is first the annexation of territories and then their elevation to the rank of states, must, of course, with far more difficulty and complication, be the pattern of the empires of today, so far as they are regions of alien population. The path of the dominion settled by immigrants akin to their home population, Siberia, Canada, and so forth, to equal citizenship with the people of the mother country is by comparison simple and plain. And so the discussion of the future of the overseas empires brings us again to the same realization to which the discussion of nearly every great issue arising out of this war has pointed: the realization of the imperative necessity of some great council or conference, some permanent overriding body, call it what you will, that will deal with things more broadly than any nationalism or patriotic imperialism can possibly do. That body must come into human affairs. Upon the courage and imagination of living statesmen, it depends whether it will come simply and directly into concrete reality, or whether it will materialize slowly, though it may be centuries of blood and blundering from such phantom anticipations as this, anticipations that now haunt the thoughts of all politically minded men. Chapter 12. The Outlook for the Germans. Section 1. Whatever some of us among the Allies may say, the future of Germany lies with Germany. The utmost ambition of the Allies falls far short of destroying or obliterating Germany. It is to give the Germans so thorough and memorable an experience of war that they will want no more of it for a few generations, and, failing the learning of that lesson, to make sure that they will not be in a position to resume their military aggressions upon mankind with any hope of success. After all, It is not the will of the Allies that has determined even this resolve. It is the declared and manifest will of Germany to become predominant in the world that has created the alliance against Germany and forged and tempered our implacable resolution to bring militarist Germany down. And the nature of the coming peace of the politics that will follow the peace are much more dependent upon German affairs than upon anything else whatever. This is so clearly understood in Great Britain that there is scarcely a newspaper that does not devote 2 or 3 columns daily to extracts from the German newspapers and from letters found upon German killed, wounded, or prisoners, and to letters and descriptive articles from neutrals upon the state of the German mind. There can be no doubt that the British intelligence has grasped and kept hold upon the real issue of this war with an unprecedented clarity. At the outset, there came declarations from nearly every type of British opinion that this war was a war against the Hohenzollern militarist idea, against Prussianism, and not against Germany. In that respect, Britain has documented herself to the hilt. There have been, of course, a number of passionate outcries and wild accusations against Germans as a race during the course of the struggle, but to this day, opinion is steadfast not only in Britain, but if I may judge from the papers I read and the talk I hear, throughout the whole English-speaking community, that this is a war not of races but ideas. I am so certain of this that I would say if Germany, by some swift convulsion, expelled her dynasty and turned herself into a republic, it would be impossible for the British government to continue the war for long, whether it wanted to do so or not. The forces in favour of reconciliation would be too strong. There would be a complete revulsion from the present determination to continue the war to its bitter but conclusive end. It is fairly evident that the present German government understands this frame of mind quite clearly and is extremely anxious to keep it from the knowledge of the German peoples. Every act or word from a British source that suggests an implacable enmity against the Germans as a people, every wartime caricature and insult, is brought to their knowledge. It is the manifest interest of the Hohenzollern and Prussianism to make this struggle a race struggle and not merely a political struggle, and to keep a wider breach between the peoples than the governments. The Made in Germany grievance has been used to the utmost against Great Britain as an indication of race hostility. The everyday young German believes firmly that it was a blow aimed especially at Germany, that no such regulation affected any goods but German goods, and the English, with their characteristic heedlessness, have never troubled to disillusion him. But even the British caricaturists and the British soldier betray their fundamental opinion of the matter in their very insults. They will not use a word of abuse for the German as Germans. They call them Huns because they are thinking of Attila, because they are thinking of them as invaders under a monarch of peaceful France and Belgium, and not as a people living in the land of their own. In Great Britain there is to this day so little hostility for Germans as such that recently a nephew of Lord Haldane's, Sir George Macgill, has considered it advisable to manufacture race hostility and provide the Hohenzollern with instances and quotations through the exertions of a preposterous anti-German league. Disregarding the essential evils of the Prussian idea, this mischievous organization has set itself to persuade the British people that the Germans are diabolical as a race. It has displayed great energy and ingenuity in pestering and insulting naturalized Germans and people of German origin in Britain below the rank of the royal family, that is, and in making enduring bad blood between them and the authentic British. It busies itself in breaking up meetings at which sentiments friendly to Germany might be expressed, sentiments which, if they could be conveyed to German hearers, would certainly go far to weaken the determination of the German social democracy to fight to the end. There can, of course, be no doubt of the good faith of Sir George Macgill, but he could do the Kaiser no better service than to help in consolidating every rank and class of German by this organization of foolish violence of speech and act, by this profession of an irrational and implacable hostility. His practical influence over here is trivial. Thanks to the general good sense and the love of fair play in our people, but there can be little doubt that his intentions are about as injurious to the future peace of the world as any intentions could be, and there can be no doubt that intelligent use is made in Germany of the frothings and ravings of his followers. Here, you see, is the disposition of the English, the imperialists will say to the German pacifists. They are dangerous lunatics. Clearly, we must stick together to the end. The stuff of Sir George Macgill's League must not be taken as representative of any considerable section of British opinion, which is, as a whole, nearly as free from any sustained hatred of the Germans as it was at the beginning of the war. There are, of course, waves of indignation at such deliberate atrocities as the Lusitania outrage or the Zeppelin raids. Wittenberg will not easily be forgotten, but it would take many Sir George Macgills to divert British anger from the responsible German government to the German masses. That lack of any essential hatred does not mean that British opinion is not solidly for continuation of this war against militarist imperialism to its complete and final defeat. But if that can be defeated to any extent in Germany by the Germans, if the way opens to a Germany as unmilitary and pacific as was Great Britain before this war, there remains from the British point of view nothing else to fight about. With the Germany of Vorwärts, which I understand would evacuate and compensate Belgium and Serbia, set up a buffer state in Alsace-Lorraine, and another in the restored Poland, including Posen, the spirit of the Allies has no profound quarrel at all, has never had any quarrel. We would only too gladly meet that Germany at a green table tomorrow, and set to work arranging the compensation of Belgium and Serbia, and tracing over the outlines of the natural map of mankind, the new political map of Europe. Still, it must be admitted that not only in Great Britain but in all the Allied countries, one finds a certain active minority corresponding to Sir George Macgill's noisy following, who profess to believe that all Germans to the third and fourth generation, save and except the Hanoverian royal family, domiciled in Great Britain, are a vile, treacherous and impossible race, a race animated by an incredible racial vanity, a race which is indeed scarcely anything but a conspiracy against the rest of mankind. The ravings of many of these people can only be paralleled by the stuff about the cunning of the Jesuits that once circulated in ultra-Protestant circles in England. Elderly Protestant ladies used to look under the bed and in the cupboard every night for a Jesuit, just as nowadays they look for a German spy, and as no doubt all German ladies now look for Sir Edward Grey. It may be useful, therefore, at the present time, to point out that not only is the aggressive German idea not peculiar to Germany, not only are there endless utterances of French chauvinists and British imperialists to be found entirely as vain, unreasonable and aggressive, but that German militarist imperialism is so little representative of the German quality that scarcely one of its leading exponents is a genuine German. Of course, there is no denying that the Germans are a very distinctive people, as distinctive as the French. But their distinctions are not diabolical. Until the middle of the 19th century, it was the fashion to regard them as a race of philosophical incompetence. Their reputation as a people of exceptionally military quality sprang up in the weedbed of human delusions between 1866 and 1872. It will certainly not survive this war. Their reputation for organization is another matter. They are an orderly, industrious, and painstaking people. They have a great respect for science, for formal education, and for authority. It is their respect for education which has chiefly betrayed them and made them the instrument of the Hohenzollern folly. Mr. F. M. Hoefer has shown this quite conclusively in his admirable but ill-named book, When Blood is Their Argument. Their minds have been systematically corrupted by base historical teaching, and the inculcation of a rancid patriotism. They are a people under the sway of organized suggestion. This catastrophic war and its preparation have been their chief business for half a century. Nonetheless, their peculiar qualities have still been displayed during that period. They have still been able to lead the world in several branches of social organization and in the methodical development of technical science. Systems of ideas are perhaps more readily shattered than built up. The aggressive patriotism of many Germans must be already darkened by serious doubts, and I see no inherent impossibility in hoping that the mass of the Germans may be restored to the common sanity of mankind, even in the 20 or 30 years of life that perhaps still remained for me. Consider the names of the chief exponents of the aggressive German idea, and you will find that not one is German. The first begetter of Nietzsche's blonde beast, and of all that great flood of rubbish about a strange superior race with whitish hair and blue eyes that has so fatally rotted the German imagination, was a Frenchman named Gobineau. We British are not altogether free from the disease. As a small boy, I read the history of J.R. Green and fed my pride upon the peculiar virtues of my Anglo-Saxon blood. It was not a German but a renegade Englishman of the Englishman-hating Whig type, Mr. Houston Stuart Chamberlain, who carried the Gobineau theory to that delirious level which claims Dante and Leonardo as Germans, and again it was not a German but a British peer still among us, Lord Redesdale, who, in his eulogistic preface to the English translation of Chamberlain's Torrent of Folly, hinted not obscurely that the real father of Christ was not the Jew, Joseph, but a much more Germanic person. Neither Clausewitz, who first impressed upon the German mind the theory of ruthless warfare, nor Bernhardi, nor Treitschke, who did as much to build up the emperor's political imagination, strike one as bearing particularly German names. There are indeed very grave grounds for the German complaint that Germany has been the victim of alien flattery and alien precedents. And what after all is the Prussian dream of world empire but an imitative response to the British Empire and the adventure of Napoleon? The very title of the German emperor is the name of an Italian, Caesar, far gone in decay. And the backbone of the German system at the time present is the Prussian, who is not really a German at all, but a Germanized Wend. Take away the imported and imposed elements from the things we fight today, leave nothing but what is purely and originally German, and you leave very little. We fight dynastic ambition, national vanity, greed, and the fruits of 50 years of basely conceived and efficiently conducted education. The majority of sensible and influential Englishmen are fully aware of these facts. This does not alter their resolution to beat Germany thoroughly and finally, and if Germany remains Hohenzollern after the war, to do their utmost to ring her in with commercial alliances, tariffs, navigation and exclusion laws that will keep her poor and powerless and out of mischief so long as her vice remains in her. But these considerations of the essential innocence of the German do make all the systematic hostility which the British have had forced upon them a very uncongenial and reluctant hostility. Pro-civilization and not anti-German is the purpose of the Allies, and the speculation of just how relentlessly and for how long this ring of suspicion and precaution need be maintained about Germany, of how soon the German may decide to become once more a good European, is one of extraordinary interest to every civilized man. In other words, what are the prospects of a fairly fundamental revolution in German life and thought and affairs in the years immediately before us? In a sense, every European country must undergo revolutionary changes as a consequence in the enormous economic exhaustion and social dislocations of this war. But what I propose to discuss here is the possibility of a real political revolution, in the narrower sense of the word, in Germany, a revolution that will end the Hohenzollern system, the German dynastic system, altogether, that will democratize Prussia and put an end forever to that secretive scheming of military aggressions, which is the central quarrel for Europe with Germany. It is the most momentous possibility of our times, because it opens the way to an alternative state of affairs that may supersede the armed watching and systematic war of tariffs, prohibitions, and exclusions against the Central Empires that must quite unavoidably be the future attitude of the pledged allies to any survival of the Hohenzollern Empire. We have to bear in mind that in this discussion, we are dealing with something very new and quite untried hitherto by anything but success. That new Germany, whose unification began with the spoliation of Denmark, was completed at Versailles. It is not a man's lifetime old. Under the state socialism and aggressive militarism of the Hohenzollern regime, it had been led to a level of unexampled pride and prosperity, and it plunged shouting and singing into this war, confident of victories. It is still being fed with dwindling hopes of victory, no longer unstinted hopes but still hopes, by a sort of political bread card system. The hopes outlast the bread and butter, but they dwindle and dwindle. How is this parvenu people going to stand the cessation of hope, the realization of the failure and fruitlessness of such efforts as no people on earth have ever made before? How are they going to behave when they realize fully that they have suffered and died and starved and wasted all their land in vain? When they learn too that the cause of their war was a trick and the Russian invasion a lie. They have a large democratic press that will not hesitate to tell them that does already, to the best of its ability, disillusion them. They are a carefully trained and educated people, disciplined people, it is true, but the solicitude of the German government everywhere apparent. Thus, to keep the resentment of the people directed to the proper quarter is, I think, just one of the things that are indicative of the revolutionary possibilities in Germany. The Allied government let opinion, both in their own countries and in America, shift for itself. They do not even trouble to mitigate the inevitable exasperation of the military censorship by an intelligent and tactful control. The German government, on the other hand, has organized the putting of the blame upon other shoulders than its own elaborately and ably from the very beginning of the war. It must know its own people best, and I do not see why it should do this if there were not very dangerous possibilities ahead for itself in the national temperament. Footnote 4. A recent circular, which Vorwärts quotes, sent by the education officials to the teachers of Frankfurt, main points out of the necessity of the beautiful task of inculcating a deep love for the House of Hohenzollern, Crown Prince, grin and all, and concludes, all efforts to excuse or minimize or explain the disgraceful acts which our enemies have committed against Germans all over the world are to be firmly opposed by you, should you see any signs of these efforts entering the schools. It is one of the commonplaces of this question that, in the past, the Germans have always been loyal subjects and never made a revolution. It is alleged that there has never been a German republic. That is by no means conclusively true. The nucleus of Swiss freedom was the German-speaking cantons about the Lake of Lucerne. Tell was a German, and he was glorified by the German Schiller. No doubt the Protestant Reformation was largely a business of dukes and princes, but the underlying spirit of that revolt also lay in the German national character. The Anabaptist insurrection was no mean thing in rebellions, and the history of the Dutch, who are after all only the extreme expression of the Low German type, is a history of the most stubborn struggle for freedom in Europe. This legend of German docility will not bear close examination. It is true that they are not given to spasmodic outbreaks, and that they do not lend themselves readily to intrigues and pronunciamentos, but there is every reason to suppose that they have the heads to plan and the wills to carry out as sound and orderly and effective a revolution as any people in Europe. Before the war drove them frantic, The German comic papers were by no means suggestive of an abject worship of authority and royalty for their own sakes. The teaching of all forms of morality and sentimentality in schools produces not only belief but reaction, and the livelier and more energetic the pupil, the more likely he is to react rather than accept. Whatever the feelings of the old women of Germany may be towards the Kaiser and his family, my impression of the opinion of Germans in general is that they believed firmly in empire, Kaiser and militarism, wholly and solely because they thought these things meant security, success, triumph, more and more wealth, more and more Germany, and all that had come to them since 1871 carried on to the nth degree. I do not think that all the schoolmasters of Germany, teaching in unison at the tops of their voices, will sustain that belief beyond the end of this war. At present, every discomfort and disappointment of the German people is being sedulously diverted into rage against the Allies, and particularly against the English. This is all very well as long as the war goes on with a certain effect of hopefulness. But what when presently the beam has so tilted against Germany that an unprofitable peace has become urgent and inevitable? How can the Hohenzollern suddenly abandon his pose of righteous indignation and make friends with the accursed enemy? And how can he make any peace at all with us while he still proclaims us accursed? Either the emperor has to go to his people and say, "We promised you victory and it is defeat," or he has to say, "It is not defeat, but we are going to make peace with these Russian barbarians who invaded us, with the incompetent English who betrayed us, with all these degenerate and contemptible races you so righteously hate and despise, upon such terms that we shall never be able to attack them again. This noble and wonderful war is to end in this futility and these graves. You were tricked into it, and you were tricked into war in 1870, but this time it has not turned out quite so well. And besides, after all, we find we can continue to get on with these people." In either case, I do not see how he can keep the habitual and cultivated German hate pointing steadily away from himself. So long as the war is going on, that may be done, but when the soldiers come home, the hate will come home as well. In times of war, people may hate abroad and with some unanimity. But after the war, with no war going on, or any prospect of a fresh war, with every exploiter and every industrial tyrant who has made his unobtrusive profits while the country scowled and spat at England, stripped of the cover of that excitement, then it is inevitable that much of this noble hate of England will be seen for the cant it is. The cultivated hate of the war phase, reinforced by the fresh hate born of confusion and misery, will swing loose, as it were, seeking dispersedly for objects. The petty, incessant irritations of proximity will count for more, the national idea for less. The Hohenzollern and the Junkers will have to be very nimble indeed if the German accomplishment of hate does not swing round upon them. It is a common hypothesis with those who speculate on the probable effects of these disillusionments that Germany may break up again into its component parts. It is pointed out that Germany is, so to speak, a palimpsest, that the broad design of the great black eagle and the imperial crown are but newly painted over a great number of particularisms, and that these particularisms may return. The empire of the Germans may break up again. That I do not believe. The forces that unified Germany lie deeper than the Hohenzollern. Adventure, print, paper, and the spoken word have bound Germany now into one people for all time. Nonetheless, those previous crowns and symbols that still show through the paint of the new design may help greatly, as that weakens under the coming stresses to disillusion men about its necessity. There was, they will be reminded, a Germany before Prussia, before Austria, for the matter of that. The empire has been little more than the first German experiment in unity. It is a newfangled thing that came and may go again, leaving Germany still a nation, still with a sense of a common fatherland. Let us consider a little more particularly the nature of the mass of population whose collective action in the years immediately ahead of us we are now attempting to forecast. Its social strata are only very inexactly equivalent to those of the countries of the pledged allies. First, there are the masses of the people. In England, for purposes of edification, we keep up the legend of the extreme efficiency of Germany, the high level of German education, and so forth. The truth is that the average elementary education of the common people in Britain is superior to that of Germany, that the domestic efficiency of the British common people is greater, their moral training better, and their personal quality higher. This is shown by a number of quite conclusive facts, of which I will instance merely the higher German general death rate, the higher German infantile death rate, the altogether disproportionate percentage of crimes of violence in Germany, and the indisputable personal superiority of the British common soldier over his German antagonist. It is only when we get above the level of the masses that the position is reversed. The ratio of public expenditure upon secondary and higher education in Germany, as compared with the expenditure upon elementary education, is out of all proportion to the British ratio. Directly, we come to the commercial, directive, official, technical, and professional classes in Germany. We come to classes far more highly trained, more alert intellectually, more capable of collective action, and more accessible to general ideas than the less numerous and less important corresponding classes in Britain. This great German middle class is the strength and substance of the new Germany. It has increased proportionally to the classes above and below it. It has developed almost all its characteristics during the last half-century. At its lower fringe it comprehends the skilled and scientifically trained artisans. It supplies the brains of social democracy, and it reaches up to the world of finance and quasi-state enterprise. And it is the dark horse in all these speculations. Hitherto, this middle class has been growing almost unawares. It has been so busy coming into existence and growing. There has been so much to do since 1871 that it has had scarcely a moment to think round the general problem of politics at all. It has taken the new empire for granted as a child takes its home for granted, and its state of mind today must be rather like that of an intelligent boy who suddenly discovers that his father's picturesque and wonderful speculations have led to his arrest and brought the brokers into the house, and that there is nothing for it but to turn to and take control of the family affairs. In Germany, the most antiquated and most modern of European states, the old dynastic Germany of the princes and junkers has lasted on by virtue of exceptional successes and prestige into the world of steel and electricity. But their prestige has paled before the engineering of Krupp. Their success evaporates. A new nation awakens a self-consciousness only to find itself betrayed into apparently irreconcilable hostility. What will be the quality of the monarch and court and junkerdom that will face this awakening new Germany? The monarch will be before very long the present crown prince. The Hohenzollerns have at least the merit of living quickly, and the present emperor draws near his allotted term. He will break a record in his family if he lives another dozen years, so that quite soon after the war this new disillusioned Germany will be contemplating the imperial graces of the present crown prince. In every way he is an unattractive and uninspiring figure. He has identified himself completely with that militarism that has brought about the European catastrophe. In repudiating him, Germany will repudiate her essential offense against civilization. And he appears to be the sort of personality that it is a pleasure to repudiate. He or some kindred agent will be the symbol of royalty in Germany through all those years of maximum stress and hardship ahead. Throughout the greater part of Germany, the tradition of loyalty to his house is not a century old, and the real German loyalty is racial and national, far more than dynastic. It is not the Hohenzollern overall that they sing about. It is Deutschland, and as in the case of all imperfectly civilized people, songs of hate for foreigners, but it needed a decadent young American to sing. Thou Prince of Peace, thou God of War, to the dismal rhetorician of Potsdam. Real emperors reconcile and consolidate peoples, for an empire is not a nation, but the Hohenzollern have never dared to be anything but sedulously national. And advocates of black letter, they know the people they have to deal with. This new substantial middle mass of Germany has never been on friendly terms with the Germany of the court and the landowner. It has inherited a Bürgerlich tradition and resented even while it tolerated the swagger of the aristocratic officer. It tolerated it because that sort of thing was supposed to be necessary to the national success. But Munich, the comic papers, Herr Harden, Vorwärts speak, I think, for the central masses of German life far more truly than any official utterances do. They speak in a voice, a little gross, very sensible, blunt, with a kind of heavy humour. That German voice one may not like, but one must needs respect it. It is at any rate not bombastic. It is essentially honest. When the imperial eagle comes home with half its feathers out like a crow that has met a bear, when the surviving aristocratic officers reappear with a vastly diminished swagger in the beer gardens, I believe that the hitherto acquiescent middle classes and skilled artisan class of Germany will entirely disappoint those people who expect them to behave either with servility or sentimental loyalty. The great revolutionary impulse of the French was passionate and generous. The revolutionary impulse of Germany may be even more deadly. It may be contemptuous. It may be that they will not even drag emperor and nobles down. They will shove them aside. In all these matters, one must ask the reader to enlarge his perspectives at least as far back as the last 3 centuries. The galaxy of German monarchies that have overspread so much of Europe is a growth of hardly more than 2 centuries. It is a phase in the long process of the breakup of the Roman Empire and of the Catholic system that inherited its tradition. These royalties have formed a class apart, breathing only among themselves and attempting to preserve a sort of caste internationalism in the face of an advance in human intelligence, a spreading of printing, reading and writing that makes inevitably for the recrudescence of national and race feeling, and the increasing participation of the government in people. In Russia and England, these originally German dynasties are meeting the problems of the new time by becoming national. They modify themselves from year to year. The time when Britain will again have a queen of British race may not be very remote. The days when the affairs of Europe could be discussed at Windsor in German and from a German standpoint ended with the death of Queen Victoria, and it is only in such improvised courts as those of Greece and Bulgaria that the national outlook can still be contemplated from a foreign standpoint and discussed in a foreign tongue. The age when the monarchical system made the courts of 3/4 of Europe a German's fatherland has ended forever, and with that, the last rational advantage of monarchy and royalist sentimentality disappears from the middle-class German's point of view. So it seems to me that the following conclusions about the future of Germany emerge from these considerations. It is improbable that there will be any such revolution as overthrew French imperialism in 1871. The new Prussian imperialism is closer to the tradition of the people and much more firmly established through the educational propaganda of the past half-century. But liberal forces in Germany may nevertheless be strong enough to force a peace upon the Hohenzollern Empire so soon as any hopes of aggressive successive die away, before the utmost stage of exhaustion is reached, early in 1917 perhaps, or at latest in 1918. This, we suppose, will be a restrictive peace so far as Germany is concerned, humiliating her and hampering her development. The German press will talk freely of a renewal of the struggle, and this will help to consolidate the pledged allies in their resolve to hold Germany on every front and to retard her economic and financial recovery. The dynasty will lose prestige gradually, and the true story of the war will creep slowly into the German consciousness, and the idea of a middle-class republic, like the French Republic, only defensively militant and essentially pacific and industrial, will become more and more popular in the country. This will have the support of strong journalists of the hardened type, for example. The dynasty tends to become degenerate, so that the probability of either some gross scandals or an ill-advised reactionary movement back to absolutism may develop a crisis within a few years of the peace settlement. The mercantile and professional classes will join hands with the Social Democrats to remove the decaying incubus of the Hohenzollern system, and Germany will become a more modern and larger repetition of the Third French Republic. This collapse of the Germanic monarchical system may spread considerably beyond the limits of the German Empire. It will probably be effected without much violence as a consequence of the convergence and maturity of many streams of very obvious thought. Many of the monarchs concerned may find themselves still left with their titles, palaces, and personal estates, and merely deprived of their last vestiges of legal power. The way will thus be open for a gradual renewal of good feeling between the people of Germany and the Western Europeans. This renewal will be greatly facilitated by the inevitable fall in the German birth rate that the shortage of economies of this war will have done much to promote, and by the correlated discrediting of the expansionist idea. By 1960 or so, the alteration of perspectives will have gone so far that historians will be a little perplexed to explain the causes of the Great War. The militarists' monomania of Germany will have become incomprehensible, her literature incredible and unreadable. Such is my reading of the German horoscope. I doubt if there will be nearly so much writing and reading about the Great War in the latter half of the 20th century as there was about Napoleon at the end of the 19th. The Great War is essentially undramatic. It was no hero. It has no great leaders. It is a story of the common sense of humanity suppressing certain tawdry and vulgar ideas and ambitions and readjusting much that was wasteful and unjust in social and economic organization. It is the story of how the spirit of man was awakened by a nightmare of a warlord. The nightmare will fade out of mind, and the spirit of man, with revivified energies, will set about the realities of life, the re-establishment of order, the increase of knowledge and creation. Amid these realities, the great qualities of the Germans mark them for a distinguished and important role. The primary business of the Allies is not reconciliation with Germany. Their primary concern is to organize a great league of peace about the world, with which the American states and China may either unite or establish a permanent understanding. Separate attempts to restore friendship with the Germans will threaten the unanimity of the League of Peace, and perhaps renew the intrigues and evils of the Germanic dynastic system, which this war may destroy. The essential restoration of Germany must be the work of German men speaking plain-sense German and inducing their country to hold out its hand, not to this or that suspicious neighbour, but to mankind. A militarist Germany is a Germany self-condemned to isolation or world empire. A Germany which has returned to the ways of peace, on the other hand, will be a country that cannot be kept out of the system of civilization. The tariff wall cannot be lowered. The watchful restrictions cannot but be discontinued against such a Germany. Europe is a system with its heart half used, so long as Germany is isolated. The German population is and will remain the central and largest mass of people in Europe. That is a fact as necessary as the Indianism of India. To reconstruct modern civilization without Germany would be a colossal artificial task that would take centuries to do. It is inconceivable that Germany will stand out of the Europeanism so long as to allow the trade routes of the world to be entirely deflected from her. Her own necessities march with the natural needs of the world. So, that I give the alliance for the isolation of Germany at the outside of life of 40 years before it ceases to be necessary through the recovered willingness of the Germans to lay aside aggression. But this is not a thing to be run at too hastily. It may be easily possible to delay this national general reconciliation of mankind by an unreal effusion. There will be no advantage in forcing the feelings of the late combatants. It is ridiculous to suppose that, for the next decade or so, whatever happens, any Frenchmen are going to feel genial about the occupation of their northeast provinces, or any Belgians smile at the memory of Dinant or Louvain, or the Poles or Serbs forgive the desolation of their country, or any English or Russians take a humorous view of the treatment their people have had as prisoners in Germany. So long as these are living memories, they will keep a barrier of dislike about Germany. Nor is it probable that the ordinary German is going to survey the revised map of Africa with a happy sense of relief, or blame no one but himself for the vanished prosperity of 1914. That is asking too much of humanity. Unless I know nothing of Germany, Germany will bristle with denkmauls to keep open all such sores. The dislike of Germany by the Allied nations will be returned in the hostility of a thwarted and disappointed people. Not even the neutrals will be aloof from these hostilities and resentments. The world will still, in 1950 or so, be throwing much passion into the rights and wrongs of the sinking of the Lusitania. There will be a bitterness in the memories of this and the next generation that will make the spectacle of ardent Frenchmen or Englishmen or Belgians or Russians embracing Germans with gusto unpleasant, to say the least of it. We may bring ourselves to understand, we may bring ourselves to a cold and reasonable forgiveness, we may suppress our Sir George MacGills and so forth, but it will take 60 or 70 years for the two sides in this present war to grow kindly again. Let us build no false hopes nor pretend to any false generosities. These hatreds can die out only in one way, by the passing of a generation, by the dying out of the wounded and the wronged. Our business, our unsentimental business, is to set about establishing such conditions that they will so die out. And that is the business of the sane Germans too. Behind the barriers this war will have set up between Germany and anti-Germany, the intelligent men in either camp must prepare the ultimate peace they will never enjoy, must work for the days when their sons at least may meet as they themselves can never meet, without accusation or resentment, upon the common business of the world peace. But this is not to be done by any conscientious sentimentalities, any slobbering denials of unforgettable injuries. We want no pro-German leagues any more than we want anti-German leagues. We want patience and silence. My reason insists upon the inevitableness and necessity of this ultimate reconciliation. I will do no more than I must to injure Germany further, and I will do all I can to restore the unity of mankind. Nonetheless, it is true that for me, for all the rest of my life, the Germans I shall meet, the German things I shall see, will be smeared with the blood of my people and my friends that the willfulness of Germany has split.